The ER doors didn't swing open. They exploded. 4 soldiers in full combat gear burst through, carrying a woman whose chest was soaked through with dark red, her lips already going blue. The trauma bay erupted, monitors shrieking, nurses colliding, a physician shouting orders that nobody could follow fast enough to matter. And in the middle of that chaos stood a woman who had been suspended 3 days earlier, stripped of her badge, told she was a liability. She looked at the dying soldier on that gurney. She looked at the doctor who had destroyed her career. Then she stepped forward anyway. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because we drop stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Smash that like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The first thing people noticed about Nora Calloway was that she never raised her voice. Not when a patient coded at 2 a.m. with no senior physician in the building, and the only resident on call was 26 years old and had never run a resuscitation without supervision. Not when the medication cart jammed against the wall in the middle of a shift change and the attending on call told her, without looking up from his chart, to sort it out herself. Not when she spent 40 minutes documenting a clinical concern in precise and careful language, submitted it through the proper channels, and received no response. In 11 months at Harlow Falls Medical Center in Denton Ridge, Montana, Nora Calloway had not once raised her voice, and the people who worked around her had developed a variety of theories about what that meant. The charge nurses on the day shift thought it meant she was steady, the kind of steady that held a floor together during the kind of nights that made newer nurses question their career choices. The second-year residents thought it meant she was difficult to read, which in their professional vocabulary was a polite way of saying they couldn't find the lever that made her react the way people were supposed to react when a physician communicated with a certain kind of authority. The senior attendings mostly didn't think about her at all, which was its own kind of statement. In hospital culture, invisibility and irrelevance were indistinguishable from the outside. She had arrived in Denton Ridge in January with 2 suitcases, a valid nursing license, a stack of certifications that the credentialing office found entirely satisfactory, and a transfer packet from a hospital in the Pacific Northwest that was thorough in the places that needed to be thorough and careful in the places that could afford to be vague. The HR coordinator had asked in the pleasant, offhand manner of someone making conversation, rather than conducting an investigation, why she was leaving a larger facility for a regional hospital in a town of 12,000 people, surrounded by mountains and 1 traffic light. Nora had said she wanted a change of pace. The coordinator had smiled and moved on to the benefits paperwork. Nobody pressed further. That was one of the things Nora had understood about Denton Ridge. Before she arrived, small communities with working hospitals depended on staff who showed up consistently, didn't generate interpersonal drama, and brought their competence without requiring extensive management. She satisfied all 3 requirements from the first week. She arrived before the start of her shifts. She stayed past the end of them, without marking the extra time on her clock out. She had not, in 11 months, been involved in a single conflict that required a charge nurse to intervene. She had been involved in 2 clinical conflicts. Both of them, from first to last, had involved Dr. Roland Fitch. Fitch had been Harlow Falls chief emergency attending for 6 years, and in those 6 years, he had developed a working philosophy about the structure of emergency medicine that he would never have identified as a philosophy, because doing so would have required him to examine it, and examining it would have meant confronting how much of it was about him rather than about patients. Nurses were support infrastructure. That was the beginning and the end of it. Skilled, necessary, indispensable in the operational sense, but fundamentally reactive. The physician assessed. The physician determined. The physician directed. The nurse executed. This was not ego, in Fitch's understanding. This was safety. Chains of command existed because individual judgment was unreliable, and the physician's judgment, validated by years of training and institutional authority, was the judgment that the system was designed to trust. Nora had never argued with this framework directly. She had simply, on 2 occasions, demonstrated that it was not sufficient. The first time was in late February, 8 weeks after she arrived. A 63-year-old retired schoolteacher named Gerald Moss had been admitted following a low-velocity fall. At home, no head strike, no loss of consciousness, clean imaging on arrival. His initial vitals were stable. Dr. Fitch reviewed the chart at 4 in the afternoon, found nothing acute, and scheduled discharge for the following morning. Nora flagged it before she left her shift. She had run his 9 p.m. vital checks and noticed something that did not exist as a single alarming number. His heart rate had increased over the prior 4 hours, not dramatically, not outside the listed normal range, but directionally wrong, in a way that her body registered as a problem before her analytical mind had finished processing why. She adjusted his IV line during the check and felt the skin on his forearm change in inequality that she would have had difficulty reducing to a single clinical descriptor. It wasn't cold. It wasn't clammy. It was simply different from how it had felt 6 hours earlier in a way that meant something. She documented it in the chart with specific timestamps. She mentioned it to the night resident. She left a written note flagged for Dr. Fitch's morning review. Fitch read the note at 7 a.m. He reviewed the vitals. He discharged Gerald Moss at 7:45. At 11:22, Gerald Moss returned by ambulance in septic shock, the source an internal bleed that had been developing slowly since the initial fall. Its early signals visible in the pattern of changes Nora had documented the night before. He spent 4 days in the ICU and survived, which was the part that mattered most. But the attending who managed his ICU stay reviewed his ER chart carefully and found Nora's notation. And the look she gave when she found it was one Nora had seen before, the quiet, controlled acknowledgement between 2 clinical professionals that something avoidable had very nearly not been avoided. Nora never said anything about it to anyone. She had expected Fitch to say something to her. She had not expected an apology. She was not naive about how physician culture processed accountability. But she had expected some form of acknowledgement, some version of a conversation that recognized the documentation had been relevant. Instead, he walked past her the next morning without making eye contact, and she understood then that the incident had not registered for him as clinical information about a patient. It had registered as criticism, personal criticism, directed at his judgment by a nurse whose judgment he had never once considered worth evaluating. He had not confronted her about it. He had not needed to. He had simply begun watching her differently, more carefully, with the particular attentiveness of a person building a file, noting the moments where she stepped slightly ahead of her formal role, filing them away without comment, arranging the shape of the floor around her in ways that were small enough to be deniable and consistent enough to be deliberate. He redirected tasks she had initiated. He summarized her documented observations back to the room during rounds as though he had generated them independently. He created, over the following weeks, a professional environment in which Nora's contributions landed in his name, and her initiative registered as overreach. She noticed every instance of it. She documented nothing, because documenting it would have made her the person generating conflict, and she had not come to Denton Ridge to generate conflict. She had come here to do the work. The work was still there, every shift, regardless of what Fitch thought about who was doing it. The second conflict arrived in April, on a Saturday, that nobody in Denton Ridge was prepared for. A fertilizer storage facility 12 miles north of town had been remodeled for 3 years with a pressure regulation system that the owner's maintenance contractor had been quietly flagging as inadequate and internal. Reports that never reached the state regulatory office. On the morning of April 19th, the valve failed. The resulting explosion sent a pressure wave through 3 surrounding structures, collapsed part of a temporary work building, and produced 31 injured civilians in under 5 minutes. Harlow Falls activated its mass casualty protocol. It was the first activation in 6 years, and the machinery of it, the communications trees, the surge staffing, the physical rearrangement of the ER floor worked the way machinery works when it hasn't been tested recently, mostly with friction in the joints. The ER flooded fast. The ambulance bay cycled through patients in waves. The triage nurse at the door was making calls at a pace that left no margin for error. The attending physicians were distributed across the bay before the 6th patient arrived, and the floor had the particular quality of controlled crisis that everyone in emergency medicine trains for, and that still, when it actually arrives, feels slightly different from the training. The 5th patient through the door was a 29-year-old construction worker named Darius Webb. He arrived in a state that made 2 of the newer nurses step back from the gurney without consciously deciding to. His left forearm had been partially degloved by a piece of structural panel that had caught him at high velocity. The radial artery was involved. First responders on scene had packed the wound with whatever was immediately available, and the packing had held in transit until it hadn't shifting in the last quarter mile, before the ambulance bay. And by the time the gurney cleared the entrance, the bleed rate had moved into the range where the math was simple, and the window was closing. Dr. Fitch was in Bay 1 managing a patient with a head injury that was consuming his full attention. Dr. Priya Anand, a second-year resident who was one of the genuinely good ones, thoughtful, technically careful, with the kind of situational awareness that doesn't always come with training, was managing the mass casualty event for the first time in her career, and she was doing it well. She was also doing it across 2 simultaneous critical cases, and that division of attention created a gap. Not a gap of incompetence or negligence, a gap of arithmetic. 2 physicians, too many patients, arriving too fast, and a half-second interval between the moment someone needed to act on Darius Webb's arterial bleed and the moment the chain of command could formally authorize it. Nora saw the gap before it fully opened. She was at the gurney before anyone else moved, her gloved hands applying pressure with the specific angulation that targeted the anatomy of the injury, not simple compression, but directed compression, that accounted for the position of the vessel, the depth of the wound, and the way the damaged tissue was distributing force. She spoke across the bay to the nearest nurse without raising her voice, calling for a tourniquet kit and a specific size of vessel clamp. She told the nearest tech the exact angle at which to hold the patient's arm. And she said to Anand, in a voice that was flat and clear and carried no performance of urgency, precisely what she was seeing in front of her and what needed to happen in the next 40 seconds. Anand looked at her for 1 full second. She made her assessment. She nodded and followed. The tourniquet went on. The bleed came under control. Darius Webb's blood pressure, which had been moving toward a number that would have triggered a very different kind of intervention, stabilized and reversed. Nora stepped back the moment Anand had full clinical control, resumed her position on the floor, and did not mention what had happened to anyone. She thought, as she had thought in February. That was the end of it. Fitch found her 23 minutes later in the corridor outside the supply room, between patients, in the specific way of a man who had been waiting for the right moment. "Walk me through what happened in Bay 3, he said. His voice was controlled. It was always controlled. That was one of the things that made him effective. At a certain kind of confrontation, he never provided the heat that the other person needed to characterize the exchange as aggressive. Mr. Webb was hemorrhaging from a compromised radial artery, Nora said. The wound packing had failed in transport. There was a coverage gap of approximately 15 to 20 seconds between his arrival and the point at which an attending physician could have been physically present at the gurney. During that interval, the bleed rate was sufficient to move him toward hemorrhagic shock class. 3 within minutes. I intervened. Dr. Attand was the assigned attending on that case. Dr. Anand was simultaneously managing patients in Bay 2 and Bay 4. She had not yet physically reached Bay 3 when I assessed the patient. Fitch tilted his head slightly. 15 seconds, approximately. You are characterizing a 15-second window as a coverage gap that justified an unsanctioned clinical intervention. I am characterizing it as what it was. What it was, he said, with the patience of someone who has decided in advance how a conversation ends, is a nurse making an independent clinical determination about a patient who was not assigned to her, performing a vascular intervention without physician direction, and directing a resident physician in a manner that inverted the chain of command, in a mass casualty event, while on a floor that has an explicit protocol for exactly that scenario. Nora looked at him. She let a moment pass, not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she wanted to say it correctly. He's alive. That is beside the point. I think, she said, keeping her voice at the same register his was at, that it is the only point. Fitch straightened. He was 2 inches taller than her, and used it, not overtly, just in the way he arranged himself when a conversation reached this stage. I'm documenting this exchange. Director Swick will contact you within 48 hours. He left. Nora went back to her patients. The conduct review happened in the second-floor conference room, a beige, carpeted space that smelled of stale coffee and recycled air and the particular institutional inertia of decisions made by committee over many years. Director Harlan Swick arrived with a legal pad and the weariness of a moderated too many versions of this conversation to approach any one of them with genuine freshness. He was not unkind. He was also not interested in context that complicated the straightforward institutional question in front of him, which was whether Nora had operated outside her scope in a way that created liability exposure for the facility. He reviewed Fitch's documentation. He reviewed the mass casualty incident report. He reviewed Nora's personnel file, which was clean. He reviewed the patient outcome, which was positive. He set down the last document and looked at her across the table. Even when the outcome is good, he said, we cannot establish a precedent in which individual clinical judgment supersedes the chain of command during a mass casualty event. The liability exposure alone. What happens, Nora said, when the chain of command's response time exceeds the patient's survivable window? The protocol addresses extended response scenarios. The protocol assumed a response time that Darius Webb didn't have. Swick looked at her. He had the expression of a man who found this argument logically coherent and institutionally impossible. The hospital's position is that the protocol exists for a reason. We are not in the business of creating carve-outs based on individual assessment, however well-intentioned. The business, Nora said carefully, is keeping people alive. He didn't answer that. The suspension was 30 days without pay, effective immediately. Nora cleaned out her locker, returned her badge to the HR coordinator, who looked at her with the expression of someone choosing not to say the thing they were thinking, and walked out into the April afternoon. She handled the first 3 days of the suspension the way she handled most professionally adverse situations, by continuing to move. She ran longer than usual in the mornings along the creek trail where the cottonwoods were finally coming fully into leaf. She cooked real meals instead of the functional, high-protein food she consumed during working weeks. She slept more hours consecutively than she had managed in months, and the quality of that sleep told her something about how depleted the year had left her that she hadn't been willing to acknowledge while she was in it. She did not spend significant time being angry about the suspension. Anger required a kind of surprise, and she had not been surprised. She had watched the shape of this outcome developing since February. Fitch had been building toward it, and Swick had given him the institutional mechanism to complete it, and neither of them had done anything that was outside the range of what people like them did in situations like this. She understood what they were. She had understood it for months. The suspension was simply the moment when what they were became visible in a way that created a record. She had her own records. On the morning of the fourth day, Thursday, overcast, with the particular quality of cold that Montana spring holds on to past the point of reason, she was at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a book she wasn't reading when she heard it. She heard it before she had consciously identified it. A percussion from the north, low and rhythmic, heavier than the air ambulance she knew, with a frequency that moved through the floor of her apartment and registered somewhere in her chest before it registered in her ears as recognizable. She had heard that frequency in other places, in other years, in a version of her professional life that she had not discussed with anyone in Denton Ridge. Her body knew it before the rest of her caught up. She went to the window. A military utility helicopter, olive drab, no civilian markings, was descending toward the roof of Harlow Falls Medical Center 4 blocks away. Nora stood at the window for a moment. She watched the aircraft settle onto the rooftop pad. She watched the rotor wash flat in the gravel and then slow as the rotors cycled down. She put on her jacket and walked toward the hospital. She had no badge. She had no authority to be there. She signed in at the front desk as a visitor, wrote her name in the register with the unhurried confidence of someone who belongs in a building, and walked toward the ER the way she had walked it every working day for 11 months, with a purposeful, direct stride that communicated that she was going somewhere specific for a specific reason, which was the only credential that mattered in an active clinical environment. She heard the trauma bay before she reached it. The sounds of clinical emergency, not chaos, but the compressed, specific language of people managing something that was moving faster than their available resources came through the corridor and reached her at the same moment as the monitor alarms. She pushed through the door. The gurney was in the center of the trauma bay. 3 people in military utility clothing surrounded it, along with 2 hospital nurses who were managing the immediate situation as best they could with what they had been given. The patient on the gurney was a woman in her late 30s, wearing a modified field uniform with unit patches that Nora did not pause to read. Her color was wrong. Her breathing was wrong in the specific way that Nora's clinical nervous system processed instantly, completely, and without uncertainty rapid, labored, asymmetrical, with a visible difference in the rise of her left and right chest wall that pointed at a single diagnosis, with the directness of a physical fact. Dr. Roland Fitch stood 6 feet from the gurney, speaking in the measured and authoritative cadence that he used when he wanted a room to understand that he was in charge of it. Our protocol requires imaging before we make a definitive determination regarding the nature and extent of the injury. We need a CT to... There is no time for CT. The man who interrupted him was broad and very still in the way of someone who had trained themselves out of unnecessary movement. He wore the same utility clothing as the patient's companions, and his voice carried the flat, unornamented quality of a person who communicated in environments where ambiguity had consequences. She is getting worse. I need someone in this room who knows what they are looking at. I understand your concern, Fitch said, but without imaging we cannot safely. Right side, Nora said. The room turned. She was standing just inside the door, still in her civilian jacket, without gloves, without a badge, without any formal standing in this room. But her attention was entirely on the patient, reading the clinical picture with the specific focus of someone who has spent years learning to see what is actually in front of them, rather than what should be there according to protocol. Tension pneumothorax, right side. She's already mediastinally shifting. You wait for imaging, and you are going to watch her arrest in this room. Fitch turned fully toward her. Recognition moved through his expression. In sequence, first the surprise of seeing her, then the irritation at why she was here, then the beginning of a formal dismissal that arranged itself in his posture before he had finished processing all three. Miss Calloway, you are currently on suspension. You have no... Someone get me gloves. She was already moving toward the gurney, reading the patient's respiratory effort more precisely with each step. 14-gauge needle. Chest tube kit. Now, the man in military clothing looked at her. He did not look at her the way people looked at someone they were evaluating for authority. He looked at her the way people look at someone they are evaluating for accuracy. His eyes moved from her face to the patient and back. 1 second. Less. You heard her, he said to the nearest nurse. The nurse moved. Fitch stepped into the space between Nora and the gurney. Not physically blocking her, he was not that kind of person, but positioning himself as the institutional fact that she was required to acknowledge. You do not have clinical authorization to perform any intervention on this patient. If you touch that patient without my direction, I will have security remove you from this floor. Nora looked at him directly. Her voice did not change. It was the same voice she had used in every conversation with him for 11 months level, clear, carrying no effect that he could use. Then direct me, or step in and do it yourself, right now. Because if you choose neither of those options in the next 45 seconds, that patient is going to code, and it will be on the record that you were standing here when it happened. The monitor alarmed. The oxygen saturation reading dropped through 80 and kept moving. Fitch looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. The room was very quiet in the specific way that rooms get quiet when everyone present understands that a decision is being made and that the decision has a weight to it that will not go away when the moment ends. Something moved across Roland Fitch's face that Nora had never once produced in him in 11 months. Not anger, not authority. The thing underneath both of those raw, unmanaged, without the professional gloss that he wore over everything else. Uncertainty, genuine uncertainty, the kind that arrives when the gap between a person's self-image and the actual situation becomes too large to paper over with posture. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He stopped. Just stopped, as if the mechanisms that usually ran him had hit something they hadn't encountered before and didn't know how to process. And Nora, gloved now, the kit already open on the tray beside her, performed the needle decompression with a precision that did not come from the kind of training you get in a nursing program or a hospital orientation. It came from the place in her that Denton Ridge had never been permitted to see, the place built over years, and multiple deployments and procedures performed in conditions that made this trauma bay look like a simulation. Her hands were not performing steadiness. They were steady. There was a difference, and everyone in the room who had ever worked in a real emergency felt it. She felt the release. She watched the patient's color begin its reversal. She called for the chest tube setup without taking her eyes off the patient, and she talked through each step in a working tone, not calm for performance, just the natural voice of someone fully inside a task they know how to complete. Beside her, the military medic with the unit patch on his left sleeve matched her rhythm without being asked, anticipating her next move with the instinctive coordination of someone who had worked in exactly this dynamic before, in exactly the kind of environment where those skills had been forged. The oxygen saturation climbed. 83, 87, 90, 93. The man in military clothing had not moved from the left side of the gurney. His eyes had been on the patient the entire time, and when the saturation crossed 94, he exhaled, not loudly, not with visible relief, just the sound of a body releasing something that had been held under enormous pressure for the last several minutes. Nora completed the chest tube placement, confirmed position by auscultation, secured the dressing, and stepped back. She stripped her gloves. She became aware in the silence that followed that the room had rearranged itself around her without anyone deciding to rearrange it. The nurses repositioned, the military personnel closer to the gurney, and doctor. Roland Fitch standing in the same spot he had occupied when she walked through the door, as though he had been nailed there by something he hadn't seen coming. The patient's eyes opened, dark, oriented, moving through the room with the calibrated assessment of someone who had been trained to locate the relevant facts in a new environment as quickly as possible. She found the man in military clothing first. "Corvath," she said. Her voice was rough and a little slow but clear. "Status." "You're stable," he said. "You had a tension pneumo." "It's been addressed." Her eyes moved to Nora. She looked at her for a long moment. Not with gratitude, exactly. Not with the soft emotion of a near-death experience, but with the level, measuring attention of a professional taking the accurate measure of another professional. "You did the decompression," she said. "Yes." "And the tube?" "Yes." A pause. "You've done that before." Nora held her gaze. "Yes. Not always in a hospital." It was not a question. "No," Nora said. "Not always." Something resolved in the patient's expression, not relaxed, but settled. "Filed correctly." "Good work," she said. Simple, unornamented. In certain professional cultures, 2 words said in that tone carried more weight than formal commendation, and both of them knew it. Nora nodded once. The man named Corvath turned from the gurney and looked at Nora with the expression of someone who has just located a piece of information they had been missing without knowing they were missing it. He looked at her civilian jacket, at the absence of a badge, at the way she was standing in this room, not with the awkwardness of someone who didn't belong here, but with the complete unself-conscious ease of someone for whom emergency medicine was not a job, but a language. "What's your name?" he said. "Nora Calloway." He shook his head once, slowly. Not disagreeing. Correcting. "That's not what I'm asking." The room was very still. Nora looked at him. She had known, from the moment she recognized the aircraft through her apartment window, that this conversation was coming. She had spent the 4-block walk thinking about how to answer it. She had not come to a different conclusion than the honest one. "Chief Petty Officer," she said. "U.S. Navy. Special Operations Medical Support, Bravo Element attached." Corvath held her gaze. Something in his expression became quieter and more certain at the same time. "Second MSAT," he said. "I know your work. I knew it before I knew your name." The monitor beeped steadily. 96. 97. Across the trauma bay, Dr. Roland Fitch stood exactly where he had been standing for the last 4 minutes. He was looking at Nora Calloway with an expression that her face had never produced in him before, not in 11 months of shifts, not in 2 formal conflicts, not in the conduct review, not in any of the moments where she had done the things she could see needed doing while he documented why she shouldn't have done it. He was not looking at her. He was not looking at her with anger. He was not looking with the professional dismissal that had been his default register for everything she did. He was looking at her with something that had no practiced home in his expression, the face of a man confronting the distance between the version of a person he had decided existed and the version that was standing in front of him, and finding that distance much larger than he had the framework to process. Corvath turned to face the room. All of it. The nurses at the monitors. The tech by the equipment cart. The hospital staff, who had watched all of it from the moment she walked through the door. His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. "Someone," he said, "want to explain to me why she doesn't have a badge." Nobody answered him. The silence that followed Corvath's question was not the silence of people who didn't know the answer. It was the silence of people who knew it, had known it for some time, and were now sitting with a particular discomfort of having that knowledge made visible in front of someone visible, someone who was looking at it without any of the institutional conditioning that had allowed everyone else to accept it as normal. One of the ER nurses, a woman named Patrice Dole, who had worked the Harlow Falls floor for 9 years, and had, in those 9 years, developed the kind of clinical radar that comes from watching enough physicians and enough patients to know the difference between a system working and a system performing, was standing near the monitor bank. She was not looking at Corvath. She was looking at her hands. Patrice Dole had written 2 internal memos in the past 6 months. One about the medication override incident in March. One about the mass casualty event in April. Both had gone to Director Swick's office. Neither had generated a response she could document. She had not said any of this out loud in a room with this many people in it before now. Dr. Roland Fitch moved first, which surprised nobody who knew him. When a situation reached a point where silence became its own kind of accusation, Fitch's instinct was always to fill it with structure. He was very good at structure. He had built a 6-year career at 6Me, this hospital, largely on the ability to construct a version of events that was professionally defensible, regardless of what had actually happened. Ms. Calloway is serving a 30-day disciplinary suspension, he said. His voice had recovered its register, the flat, reasonable cadence that made everything he said sound like the conclusion of a careful analysis. The suspension was issued following a formal conduct review conducted by the department director. The review determined that she had performed an unsanctioned clinical intervention during a mass casualty event in violation of established protocol. Horvath turned to look at him. It was a slow turn, unhurried, the kind of movement that communicated, without any particular aggression, that the person making it was not operating on anyone else's timeline and was not impressed by anyone else's register. He looked at Fitch for a moment in the specific way of a man taking a complete inventory of something he has just decided to understand thoroughly. She performed an unsanctioned intervention, Horvath said. Correct. And the patient from that intervention? Fitch paused. Survived. Yes. And today? Horvath glanced at the gurney where Sergeant Adriana Valdez was being assessed by Dr. Priya Anand, her oxygen saturation holding at 97, her color continuing to normalize, her vitals moving in the direction that meant she was going to leave this room on her own terms. What was your plan for Sergeant Valdez? Before this woman walked through the door. The question was not rhetorical. Horvath asked it, the way he asked every question that mattered as a request for a specific, accurate answer that he intended to evaluate. Fitch straightened. The protocol for a patient presenting with respiratory compromise of unknown etiology requires imaging prior to invasive intervention. That is the standard of care. That is a sentence, Horvath said. I asked what your plan was. The room remained very still. Fitch opened his mouth. What came out was not the sentence he had intended to begin with. What came out was a pause, and into that pause the fluorescent lights hummed. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, and every person in that trauma bay did their own private version of the same calculation. Nora was not watching Fitch during any of this. She had moved to the periphery of the immediate treatment space the moment Anand had taken over Valdez's assessment, and she had been watching the patient with the particular attention of someone tracking multiple variables. Simultaneously, the saturation number, the quality of Valdez's breathing, the way she was holding her left shoulder, which suggested a secondary musculoskeletal injury that hadn't been the priority in the first 5 minutes and needed to become one now. Her left shoulder, Nora said to Anand, without preamble, without positioning it as a suggestion or softening it into a question. A C joint, probably, the way she's carrying it. Worth imaging before you move her. Anand looked at the shoulder. She looked at Valdez. She ran a quick palpation that produced a controlled hiss from Valdez, who had the pain tolerance of someone who had trained herself not to show it and was currently showing a small amount of it involuntarily. AC separation, Anand confirmed. She noted it in the chart. She didn't look at Nora when she said, "Thank you," but she said it. And she said it in the tone of one professional acknowledging another, rather than the tone of a physician thanking a visitor for a suggestion. Horvath had watched this exchange from his position near the gurney. He said nothing about it. He filed it. The junior member of his team, a compact, serious-faced medic named Specialist Ortega, who had the watchful quality of someone perpetually running a threat assessment on whatever environment he occupied, was managing the logistics of Valdez's eventual transfer, making calls, reviewing the transport protocols, coordinating the transport protocols, coordinating with whoever was on the other end of the communications link he'd been maintaining since they landed. But he had been tracking the room with the peripheral attention of a person whose training made multitasking involuntary. And at a certain point, he moved to Corvath's side and said, quietly enough that it wasn't meant for the room, "She's the one from the after-action report. Kandahar, second rotation. The arterial repair." Corvath glanced at him. "Bravo Element lost 3 people on that op," Ortega said. "She kept 2 of them alive, long enough for exfil. The report said the medic on scene had civilian nursing credentials. Nobody knew the rest of it." Corvath was quiet for a moment. Then he said, also quietly, "I know." He looked at Nora across the room. She was reviewing Valdez's chart on the wall-mounted screen, pulling up the lab results Anand had ordered, running the numbers with the automatic efficiency of someone who had been doing this for long enough that the calculations happened in the background of her thinking rather than in the foreground. She was not performing competence for the room. She was just doing the work. That was the thing about her, Corvath thought. That was the thing that had struck him. The moment she opened her mouth from the doorway, she was not here to be seen doing this. She was here because there was something that needed doing. He had worked with a lot of people in a lot of environments. The ones who needed to be seen were a different animal from the ones who just needed the problem solved. Nora Calloway was the second kind, and in his professional experience, the second kind was rarer and considerably more valuable. Director Harlan Swick arrived on the floor at 17 minutes past the initial call, which was faster than his usual response time to ER situations, and suggested that someone, probably the charge nurse, possibly the administrative coordinator, conceivably both had communicated the particular nature of this situation in terms that conveyed it was not a routine clinical incident. He came through the unit door in the manner of a man who has been interrupted from something and is managing his reaction to that interruption. And he took in the room, in the sequence of a person assessing damage, the patient on the gurney, the military personnel, Anand at the chart, Fitch standing near the monitor bank in an attitude that was subtly different from his usual posture, and Nora Calloway standing at the wall-mounted screen in her civilian jacket, reviewing patient data she had no current administrative authorization to access. He said her name, Miss Calloway. She looked up. "A word," he said. It was not a question. "In a minute," she said. He blinked. "I'm sorry, Mr. Valdez's potassium is low, and her creatinine is trending up. I want to make sure Dr. Anand has flagged it before I step away." Swick looked at Anand. Anand, who had been listening while updating the chart, said without looking up, "Already flagged." "I've got it." Nora closed the screen. She looked at Swick. "Now works," she said. He took her out of the trauma bay and into the corridor, and the doors swung shut behind them, and inside the bay the room exhaled in a collective, unspoken way. The conversation in the corridor lasted 11 minutes. Nora knew this because she counted them, not obsessively, but with the automatic time tracking of someone accustomed to environments where duration mattered. Swick's opening position was what she had expected. She was on suspension. She had entered a restricted clinical area without authorization. She had performed interventions without sanction. And the facility was now exposed to a layer of liability that he was going to need to understand before he could determine the appropriate response. She let him finish. Then she said she would have died. Swick moved his jaw in the way he did when he was receiving information he didn't want to integrate. The patient's outcome is not separate from the question of whether the correct person acted at the correct time, Nora said. I understand that you need to process the liability dimension. I'm telling you that the liability dimension exists because the correct person was not available to act, and the person who was available to act chose not to. Swick looked at her. Dr. Fitch was advocating for imaging on a patient with a saturation in the low 80s, visible tracheal deviation, and asymmetrical respiratory effort. That is not a defensible clinical position. It is a protocol applied in a situation where the protocol did not fit. You are a suspended employee with no current clinical standing at this facility, Swick said. Whatever your assessment of Dr. Fitch's clinical judgment, you cannot. I know what I can't do, Nora said. I'm telling you what I did and why and what the outcome was. What you do with that is your decision. It was always your decision. Swick was quiet for a moment. He looked at the closed door of the trauma bay. He looked at Nora. He looked at the space between the two, which contained a question he did not have a clean answer to. There will need to be a formal review, he said. There usually is, she said. She went back into the trauma bay. The next 2 hours had the quality of managed aftermath, the specific mode of an ER floor that has processed an acute event and is now running the administrative tail of it while simultaneously managing the regular patient load. Valdez was stabilized and moved to a monitored bed on the second floor, pending transfer coordination. Corvith's team redistributed across the available waiting space, with the adaptable patience of people accustomed to hurry-up-and-wait scenarios. Hassan cycles through her other patients, with the focused efficiency of someone who was running slightly above capacity and managing it by narrowing her attention to one task at a time. Nora stayed. Nobody told her to leave. Nobody told her to stay either. She simply remained on the floor, helping where help was needed, moving through the unit with the unassuming productivity that had been her defining characteristic since January, and nobody, not the charge nurse, not the floor staff, not the administrative coordinator who came down twice to check on the military situation, said anything to her about the fact that she was doing it without a badge. Patrice Dole was the first to approach her directly. She came during a quiet stretch near the end of the hour, when the bay had cleared to 2 stable patients and the ambient noise of the unit had dropped to something closer to normal. She appeared beside Nora at the medication station, with the deliberate casualness of someone who had decided to do something and was doing it before she could reconsider. I sent 2 memos, Patrice said. She was looking at the medication drawer, not at Nora. March and April, after the Moss discharge and after the mass casualty event. I documented what I witnessed in both cases, and I sent them to Swick's office. Nora was still. I didn't know that. No. Patrice pulled a medication packet from the drawer and turned it over in her hands without reading it. Because nothing happened. They went in and I got an automated acknowledgement, and that was the end of it. She paused. I should have pushed harder. I knew I should have at the time, and I didn't. Nora looked at her. Patrice Dole was a year or 2 past 50, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something more honest than it had started out as. She was not apologizing for anything. She was reporting a fact, the way a clinical professional reports a fact accurately, without embellishment, with the implicit understanding that the recipient knows what to do with it. Do you still have copies? Nora asked. Everything I sent goes through my personal work log. Patrice finally looked at her. I keep it separate from the hospital's system. Started doing it about 3 years ago after something else I'd rather not get into. Nora nodded once. Keep them. Already planning to. Patrice put the medication packet back in the drawer and walked away, and Nora stood at the station for a moment, thinking about the shape of what was assembling itself, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow and irreversible momentum of documentation accumulating in multiple places simultaneously. Her own records, Patrice's logs, Anand's direct observations, the timestamps on her submitted clinical concerns that had been received and never formally addressed. And now a military captain who had contacts she could not estimate and a very clear opinion about what he had witnessed in that trauma bay. She was thinking about this when the door to Valdez's monitored room opened and Corvith came out into the corridor, moving with the contained energy of someone who had been sitting still longer than was comfortable. He found her near the nurse's station. "Walk with me," he said. It was not quite a request and not quite an order. It was the tone of someone who communicated the same way, regardless of whether they were in a civilian hospital corridor or a forward operating base, because the situation determined the communication style in the situation. In his assessment, was currently requiring directness. They walked to the end of the corridor, away from the traffic of the unit, and Corvath said, without preamble, "I made some calls while Valdez was being moved." To who? People who know how these things work. He was looking at the window at the end of the hall, the parking lot, the mountains beyond it, the particular quality of Montana afternoon light that made distances look smaller than they were. The conduct review that suspended you, the mass casualty incident, the prior flagging incident in February. There's a pattern there that people above the facility level are going to find interesting. Nora was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't asking for that." "I know you weren't. I don't want this turned into something that's about me versus Fitch." Corvath looked at her sideways. "It's already that. The question is whether the people with authority to do something about it know what it is." He paused. "Right now, they don't have the complete picture. That's fixable." Nora leaned against the wall. She was tired in the specific way of a body that has run a significant adrenaline event and is now processing the aftermath. And she was letting herself feel it briefly, because denying it took energy she wasn't certain she had at this particular moment. "What kind of calls?" "Montana State Medical Board has a reporting mechanism for facility-level clinical concerns that don't get resolved internally," Corvath said. "I know someone who knows the process." She looked at him. "I'm not doing this for you," he said, and she could tell he meant it, which was part of why she didn't object. "I'm doing this because Valdez is alive, and the reason she's alive is that the right person was in that room, and the reason you almost weren't in that room is that someone with less competence than you decided you were a threat to his ego. I have a significant professional problem with that sequence of events." Nora was quiet for a long moment. The corridor was still around them. From somewhere down the hall came the muffled rhythm of a monitor, the distant sound of voices at the nurse's station, the ordinary background noise of a facility continuing its operations around an event that had already changed the shape of things in ways that the institution had not yet fully processed. "I've been documenting," she said finally. Corvath turned to look at her fully. "Since February," she said. "Every flag concern, every submitted memo, every intervention and its outcome, and the response or the absence of one. Timestamps on everything, maintained in a personal system separate from the hospital's records." She paused. "I didn't do it because I was planning anything. I did it because that's how I work. Documenting is the last line of accountability when everything else fails." Corvath's expression did not change, but something in it settled. The way a calculation settles and the last variable resolves. "How much?" he said. 11 months' worth." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. That was all. Just okay. But the way he said it had the quality of a decision made, a plan set in motion, a door opened that was not going to close again. They walked back toward the unit. Nora was almost to the door of the bay when a new sound reached her from the direction of Valdez's monitored room, not an alarm, but a specific tone from a communications device, the kind of short, sharp alert that meant priority contact, rather than routine monitoring. Corvath's stride shifted slightly, and he moved toward the room, and Nora followed because the change in his pace communicated something she had learned in an earlier professional life to pay attention to. Specialist Ortega was already at the door. He had his phone in his hand, and his expression had changed from the watchful assessment of the past 2 hours to something more specific and less readable. He spoke to Corvath in a low, fast exchange that Nora caught the edges of unit designation, a location, a time reference that suggested urgency rather than routine scheduling. Corvath listened. His jaw tightened slightly. He looked at Ortega. "How long?" 40 minutes, maybe less. They want us wheels up." Corvath looked at the door to Valdez's room. He looked at Nora. "She's not fit for transport yet," Nora said. She hadn't been part of the conversation, but the conclusion was plain. The chest tube is less than 3 hours old. You move her, in the next 40 minutes, you're taking a significant risk with the pneumothorax resolution. She needs another chest x-ray at minimum, ideally a 6-hour post-procedure check. "We don't always get ideal, Corvath, no," she said. "But you have 40 minutes. Use them correctly." He held her gaze for a moment. There was something in his expression that was not quite frustration and not quite the kind of professional respect that shows on a person's face openly. Something more complicated. The look of a man measuring a situation against a set of constraints and not being happy with the available options. "Ortega," he said, "get Anand. Tell her we need an expedited x-ray and a transfer clearance assessment." Ortega moved. Corvath said to Nora, "You'll be here." It was not a question. "I don't have a badge," she said. "You didn't have one an hour ago either." He went into Valdez's room. Nora stood in the corridor for a moment. The afternoon had, without her noticing the light through the window, at the end of the hall had changed angle, deepening toward the particular gold of late afternoon in a mountain valley, and the unit noise had shifted to the different frequency of evening handoff preparation. She went back to the floor. She helped where help was needed. A patient at Barbet who needed a line repositioned, a supply cart that had been left in a position that was blocking the trauma bay entrance, a set of lab values that needed to be communicated to a physician who was in the middle of something else and needed the information in a specific sequence to make it land usefully. She did these things psychologically, professionally. These things without being asked and without announcing them, the way she had done the work for 11 months, and the floor staff moved around her with the easy adjustment of people working alongside someone who knew what they were doing. At the nurse's station, Patrice Dole was updating her end-of-shift notes. She glanced at Nora twice during this period, and both times her expression had the quality of someone running a calculation that she had not yet finished. The third time she stopped writing and said, "Fitch went upstairs about 20 minutes ago." Nora kept her attention on the lab report she was reviewing. "To Swick's office? I'd assume." Patrice tapped her pen against the desk once. He took his incident documentation file with him. I saw it under his arm. Nora set down the lab report. She thought about this for a moment. Fitch, moving fast, carrying his version of events to the one person in the building who had the authority to make administrative decisions before the situation developed further. It was exactly the move she would have expected him to make. He was not stupid. He understood that the landscape of this afternoon had changed in ways that threatened something he valued more than he had ever valued any individual patient's outcome, which was his standing in this institution and the unquestioned authority that came with it. He was going to Swick to set the narrative before anyone else did. She thought about her 11 months of documentation sitting in a personal file on a password-protected drive in her apartment 4 blocks away. She thought about Patrice's memos. She thought about Anand's direct observations, which Anand had already demonstrated a willingness to state in rooms with directors in them. She thought about Corvath and whatever calls he had made and whatever calls he was still making, and the particular quality of person who makes those kinds of calls and does not make them carelessly. She thought about Sergeant Valdez in a monitored room down the hall, alive, because of a procedure performed by a woman who technically had no business being in this building today. She went to find a phone. She needed to call someone, not about Fitch, not about Swick, not about the conduct review or the suspension or any of the institutional machinery that was already grinding toward her from multiple directions. She needed to call someone who could tell her whether the state medical board reporting mechanism that Corvath had mentioned was the correct mechanism for what she had documented, or whether there was a different process that would move faster and have more direct authority over a facility-level pattern rather than an individual physician complaint. She had someone she could call, a contact from a previous chapter of her professional life, who worked in a regulatory capacity she had never had occasion to use until now. She had the number memorized, the way she memorized numbers that she might need quickly in conditions where a contact list was not accessible. She found a quiet alcove near the stairwell and dialed. The phone rang 4 times, and then a voice she recognized said her name with the particular inflection of someone who had not expected this call and was immediately running a threat assessment. Nora. I need 15 minutes, she said, and I need to know if what I've got meets the threshold for a formal board complaint, or whether we need to go a different direction. A pause. Not long the pause of someone shifting gears. Not the pause of someone deciding whether to engage. Where are you? Harlow Falls Medical Center, Denton Ridge, Montana. Another pause. Why does that name flag for me? Because 3 days ago, a military transport landed on the roof, and the chain of events since then has produced a situation that I think you're going to find significant. A beat of silence. Then, send me what you have. I'll need to go home to access it, she said. But I can have it to you within the hour. Within the hour works, the voice said. And then, in the tone of someone who has processed the summary and moved to the next question, how much do you have? 11 months, Nora said. Time-stamped. Organized. Documented in real time, not reconstructed. The silence on the other end of the line had a different quality now. Nora. The voice was careful in the way that voices get careful when they are about to say something that requires precision. If what you're describing is what I think it is, she said, then this is not going to stay at the facility level. I know, she said. Are you prepared for that? She leaned against the wall of the alcove. Through the door to the main corridor, she could hear the unit running its normal evening operation, the sounds of a working hospital, patients and staff, and the machinery of care. She had worked in this building for 11 months. She had come here for a change of pace, which had been the true answer to the coordinator's question, and also, she could admit now, not the complete one. She had come here because she had needed to stop moving long enough to remember what she was doing all of it for. She had remembered. Yes, she said. She hung up. She walked back toward the unit, and she was almost to the door of the bay when she heard the sound of raised voices from the direction of the stairwell. Not her stairwell, the one at the other end of the floor. She recognized one of the voices immediately. Roland Fitch, and then the other one lower, with the controlled force of someone who did not raise his voice because he did not need to. Corvath. She pushed through the door to the main corridor. At the far end, outside the stairwell entrance, Corvath was standing with his arms at his sides and his weight distributed in the balanced stillness of someone who was not angry and did not need to be, because the situation was already resolved in his mind, and he was simply communicating that resolution to the other party. Fitch was facing him with the rigid posture of a man whose authority was being addressed by someone who did not recognize it, which was a posture Roland Fitch had very little experience occupying and was managing poorly. Nora stopped where she was. She could not hear the words from this distance, but she could read the body language with the accuracy of someone who had spent years in environments where body language was a primary information source. And what she was reading was this. Fitch had come downstairs with his documentation file and found Corvath outside Valdez's room. And a conversation had started that Fitch had expected to control and had immediately lost control of. And he was now in the unfamiliar position of being the person in the room in the corridor who had less information, less authority, and a significantly weaker position than he had believed himself to occupy when the conversation began. Corvath said something. Fitch went still. It was the kind of stillness that comes person receives information that does not fit their existing model of the situation, and their system has not yet generated a response. Corvath was watching him with the flat, patient attention of someone who has made a statement and is waiting for the recipient to process it without particular investment in how long the processing takes. Fitch looked down the corridor. he saw Nora, and the expression on his face, that's the one she had seen in the trauma bay, the one without the professional gloss, the one that showed the actual interior of a man who had spent 6 years building a specific version of himself that was now being systematically disassembled, changed again. Something moved through it that she could not quite name. Not anger, not dismissal, not the cold certainty that had always characterized the way he looked at her before today. Something closer to the beginning of comprehension. Arriving, she thought, roughly 11 months too late. Horvath did not look back at her. He was still looking at Fitch. He said one more thing, short and direct, and then he turned and walked back toward Valdez's room without waiting for a response, the way a person walks away from a conversation they have already finished, regardless of whether the other party has caught up. Fitch stood in the corridor. Nora walked toward the elevator. She needed to go home. She needed to pull 11 months of documentation off a password-protected drive and send it to a person who had the authority and the inclination to know what to do with it. She needed to eat something and sleep at least a few hours and prepare for what was coming, and not to be significant and complicated and not particularly comfortable for anyone involved, including herself. She pressed the elevator button. Whilst she waited, her phone buzzed. A message from the contact she had called from the alcove. 2 lines. Check the facility record. Harlow Falls had a prior complaint filed against a physician 2 years ago. Unresolved. Same physician. Nora read it twice. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside. The doors closed. She stood in the small humming space between floors and looked at those 2 lines on her screen, and the shape of what she was looking at rearranged itself in her mind, not expanding into something larger exactly, but clicking into focus the way a picture clicks into focus when you've been looking at it from the wrong angle, and suddenly you shift and you see what it actually is. This was not a 6-month pattern. This was not even an 11-month pattern. This had been here before she arrived, and it had been unresolved when she arrived, and the system that was supposed to resolve it had filed it and moved on. And Roland Fitch had continued to practice medicine in this building, while a prior complaint sat in a regulatory database with a status of unresolved, and nobody, not SWIC, not the credentialing office, not the state medical board's follow-up mechanism, had connected what was already in the record to what had been accumulating on this floor for the past 11 months. The elevator opened on the ground floor. Nora walked through the lobby. She pushed through the front door into the cool Montana evening and stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside Harlow Falls Medical Center, looking at the building she had worked in for 11 months without knowing that the thing she had been documenting was older than she was. She started walking home. She had a lot to send. The walk home took 8 minutes. Nora did not run it, though her body wanted to. Running communicated urgency to the people around you, and urgency communicated that something had gone wrong, and nothing had gone wrong. Something had gone right, which was different, and required a different quality of movement, the deliberate, measured pace of someone who knows exactly where they are going, and has already decided what they are going to do when they get there. She was inside her apartment above the hardware store in 9 minutes. She was at her laptop in 10. The external drive connected with a soft click, and she navigated to the folder she had been maintaining since the 2nd week of February with the systematic attention of someone who had learned in a previous professional life that the record was always the last thing standing, when everything else had been disputed away. The folder was organized by date and incident type. Each entry contained the original documentation, her clinical notations, the submitted memos, the chart timestamps, alongside a secondary file that cross-referenced the response, or lack of one, from the administrative chain. She had not created this system because she was anticipating a fight. She had created it because documentation was how she thought, the same way some people processed experience by talking and others by writing. She documented the way she breathed automatically, completely, and with the understanding that accuracy was the only thing that survived when everything else became contested. She compressed the folder and attached it to a secure message to the contact she had called from the alcove. She added a cover note that was 3 sentences long, what the documentation covered, the date range, and the name of the prior unresolved complaint she needed cross-referenced. She sent it at 6:47 p.m. Then she made coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and waited. The response came at 8:22. The response came at 8:20 Thai, not from her contact address she didn't recognize, which meant her contact had forwarded the material to someone else, which meant the materials had been assessed quickly and passed up a level, which told her something about what the prior complaint record contained that she hadn't known when she made the call. The message was 4 lines. The sender identified herself as Investigator Marlene Groff, Montana State Medical Board, Complaint Review Division. She confirmed receipt of the documentation package. She confirmed that the prior complaint record referenced in Nora's cover note was currently in active status, not unresolved in the passive sense of a file that had been set aside, but actively under review by a separate investigative track that had been opened 6 weeks ago based on information from an undisclosed source. She asked Nora to be available for a call the following morning at 9 a.m. Nora read the message twice. Active status. Opened 6 weeks ago. She sat down for coffee. 6 weeks ago, placed the opening of that investigation in early April, 2 weeks before the mass casualty event, 3 weeks before the conduct review that had suspended her. Someone had filed something or generated something that had triggered a formal investigative track at the board level before any of the events of the past 3 days had occurred. Whatever Fitch had done at this hospital or at his previous facility had already attracted the attention of people with the authority to act on it, and they had been building their case while Harlow Falls Medical Center ran its normal operations around him. She had been documenting in parallel with an investigation she hadn't known existed. She went to bed at 10 and slept better than she had expected to, which she recognized as the particular sleep of a body that has been holding sustained tension and has finally identified the load-bearing structure underneath the situation. The uncertainty was still there. The outcome was not yet determined. But the shape of it had clarified, and clarity, even in an unresolved situation, was its own kind of rest. She was up at 6, running the creek trail in the gray pre-dawn light, when her phone buzzed with a message from Corvath. Valdez transferred successfully at 430. Chest tube output was minimal before removal. She's asking about you. Nora read it once, slipped the phone back into her jacket pocket, and kept running. At 9 a.m., she was at her kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and her laptop open when Investigator Groff called. Marlene Groff had the voice of a person who had conducted a very large number of interviews and had developed through that volume of experience the ability to communicate authority without performing it. She was efficient without being cold. She asked precise questions and waited for complete answers without filling the silence when Nora paused to think. "The documentation you submitted last night," Groff said. "Walk me through the structure." Nora did. She described the filing system, the timestamp methodology, the cross-referencing between her clinical notations and the administrative responses. She explained the February incident with Gerald Moss and the April mass casualty event, and the specific nature of the conduct review that had produced her suspension. She described the medication override incident that Patrice Dole had also documented. She described the clinical concern submissions that had been received and not acted upon. Groff listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, there was a short pause. "The prior complaint," Groff said. "I'm going to tell you what I can tell you, which is limited. The complaint originated from a nurse at Dr. Fitch's previous facility, a hospital in Billings, where he practiced for 4 years prior to Harlow Falls. It alleged a pattern of suppressed clinical warnings and a specific patient death that the complainant believed was connected to an overridden nursing assessment. Another pause. The complaint was filed 2 years ago. It was received, acknowledged, and placed in a review queue. It was not actively investigated until 6 weeks ago, when additional information was submitted by a second party. Who was the second party? Nora asked. I can't tell you that. Nora was quiet for a moment. Was it someone at this facility? I can't confirm or deny that either. She thought about Patrice Dole and her 2 memos. She thought about the way Patrice had said it. I should have pushed harder with the specific inflection of someone who had eventually pushed harder, through a channel she hadn't mentioned. Okay, Nora said. What I can tell you, Groff continued, is that your documentation significantly advances the existing investigation. The timestamp record you've provided covers a period and a pattern that we had partial evidence for, but not this level of specificity. A beat. You documented every incident in real time. Yes. Not reconstructed after the fact. No. A pause that was slightly longer than the ones before it. That matters, Groff said, considerably. They talked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, Groff had asked Nora to submit 3 additional documents: a formal written statement covering the mass casualty incident, a chronological summary of the medication override and the Gerald Moss discharge, and a list of other Harlow Falls staff members who had direct knowledge of any of the documented incidents. Nora agreed to have all 3 submitted by the following morning. She hung up and looked at the window. Outside, Denton Ridge was running its ordinary Thursday, the hardware store below her apartment opening, a truck making a delivery to the diner across the street, the particular unhurried pace of a small mountain town that did not know that the institutional ground beneath its only hospital was currently shifting. She opened her laptop and started writing. She wrote for 3 hours. The formal statement first, then the chronological summary, then the staff list, which she constructed carefully, not including anyone who had expressed a concern informally without formally documenting it, because informal expressions of concern belonged to the people who had made them, and she was not going to put someone on a list that might create obligations, or exposure they hadn't consented to. She included Patrice Dole. Patrice had submitted memos through official channels, which made her already part of the documented record. She included Dr. Priya Anand. Anand had made a voluntary statement to Director Swick the previous afternoon and had made clear, both in that statement and in her conduct during the Valdez incident, that she was prepared to speak to what she had witnessed. She included 2 other nurses, whose names appeared in her incident notes, as witnesses, one to the medication override, one to a separate moment during the mass casualty event that she had documented at the time, but which had not been part of the formal conduct review. She submitted everything at 12:41 p.m. At 2 o'clock, her phone rang. A Denton Ridge number she didn't recognize. She answered it. This is Director Swick. His voice had a different quality than it had in any of their previous conversations. Not softer exactly, but less defended. I'd like you to come in this afternoon. For what purpose? A pause. Are some things I think we need to discuss directly. About the conduct review. About the situation with Dr. Fitch. About... He stopped. Started again with more precision. There's been a development I think you should be informed of in person. Nora looked at her laptop screen. Her submitted documents were still in the sent folder. Timestamps visible. What kind of development? I'd rather do this in person. Director Swicks, she said. I'm currently cooperating with a Montana State Medical Board investigation. Before I have any conversation with hospital administration about the conduct review or Dr. Fitch, I need to know whether this conversation is being documented and who else will be present. A longer pause. It will be documented, he said, and I've asked Dr. Fitch to be present. Nora was quiet for a moment. I'll be there at 3, she said. She arrived at 3, exactly, through the main lobby, and signed in at the front desk with the same visitor register she had signed the previous afternoon. The lobby felt different today, not the hospital itself, which was running its normal operations, but the quality of her relationship to it, which had shifted in a way she had not fully mapped yet. She had spent 11 months here, belonging to this building in the functional sense of someone who shows up every day and does the work. She no longer belonged to it in that sense. But she was here, and her documentation was with the people who needed it, and she was present for whatever was about to happen. The second-floor conference room smelled the same. Swix was already there. Fitch was already there. There was also a third person. Nora did not recognize a woman in her mid-40s with short hair and the particular posture of a lawyer who has been in rooms like this many times and finds nothing about them surprising. She introduced herself as Dana Merritt, representing the hospital's Legal and Risk Management Office. Nora sat down. Swick cleared its skull throat. He had his legal pad, but he was not looking at it. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man who has prepared a speech and has just concluded that the speech is no longer the right approach. "Thank you for coming in." "Of course," Nora said. "I'll be direct." He glanced at Merritt, who gave a small nod. "We received a communication this morning from the Montana State Medical Board. An investigator contacted the facility regarding an active investigation into a physician-level conduct complaint. The communication indicated that the facility's records and the conduct documentation of relevant staff members may be subpoenaed as part of that investigation." The room was quiet. Fitch was sitting across the table from Nora. She had not looked at him directly since she sat down, and she did not look at him now. But she was aware of him in the peripheral way. She was always aware of the important elements in a room, his posture, which was rigid, the position of his hands, which were flat on the table, in the deliberate way of someone managing their physical presentation. The quality of his breathing, which was controlled. "I'm aware," Nora said. Swick looked at her. "You're aware." "I spoke with Investigator Groff this morning. I submitted a formal statement and supporting documentation to the board's Complaint Review Division at 12:41 p.m. The silence in the room had a different texture now. Merritt, the lawyer, wrote something on her notepad. Her expression did not change, which was itself an expression of a kind. Fitch said, "For the first time since Nora had entered the room, you submitted documentation to the board." His voice was controlled. Barely. "Yes," she said. "Without notifying the hospital. I'm not required to notify the hospital before cooperating with a regulatory investigation. You were the subject of a formal conduct review at this facility, which I believe the board's investigation will address," Nora said. She kept her voice at the same register it always was. Flat, clear, carrying nothing extra, along with several other matters that are documented in the materials I submitted. Fitch looked at her. It was the longest and most unguarded look he had ever directed at her, across 11 months and 2 formal conflicts and 100 small moments of professional diminishment. He was not performing anything in it. The professional architecture that he wore over everything had, in this specific moment, come down. And what was underneath it was not anger and not arrogance and not the cold certainty of a man who believed himself always to be the most important person in any room he occupied. What was underneath it was fear. She recognized it because she had seen it before, in different contexts, in people who had built significant structures on foundations that were not as solid as they had believed and who were confronting, in real time, the process of those structures beginning to shift. She did not feel satisfaction about it. She had known for some time that she would be in this room or a room like it, and she had not spent the preceding weeks anticipating it as a moment of personal vindication. She had spent them documenting and submitting and doing the work that needed to be done. The moment itself was just the moment. It meant what it meant. Swick was looking at his legal pad now, though she still couldn't read it. The board's investigator indicated that the existing investigation predates your recent suspension. By approximately 6 weeks, Nora said, based on what I was told this morning, and the prior complaint. Swick set down his pen. From Dr. Fitch's previous facility, Merritt looked up from her notepad. Director. It's already in what she submitted to the board, Swick said, without heat. Just with the weariness of a man who has arrived at a calculation he doesn't like and is processing it with the honesty that the situation requires. There's no privilege to assert here, Dana. He looked at Nora. I wasn't aware of the prior complaint when Dr. Fitch was credentialed at this facility. I want that on the record. It's on record, Nora said. The credentialing process. He stopped, pressed his hand briefly over his eyes in the gesture of a man managing something private. The credentialing process should have surfaced it. It didn't. That's a failure at this institution that I own. The room was very still. Fitch had not moved. His hands were still flat on the table. He was looking at a point somewhere past Nora's left shoulder, not at her, not at Swick, not at the lawyer, but at something that existed in a space none of the other people in the room could see. Merritt said carefully, Dr. Fitch, I'd strongly recommend you not make any statements in this meeting, beyond what is legally necessary. I haven't made any statements, Fitch said. His voice was very quiet. I'm aware. I'm recommending you keep it that way. A long pause. Then Fitch said, still in that quiet voice, still looking at the point past Nora's shoulder, the patient in Billings, the one the complaint was about. He stopped. Doctor. Fitch Merritt started. She was 44 years old, he said. Post-surgical. The nurse on the floor flagged a change in her respiratory pattern. I reviewed the chart and determined it was within acceptable parameters for her recovery stage. He stopped again. She died 6 hours later. Pulmonary embolism. The nurse's flag was consistent with early PE presentation. The room did not move. I told myself slag effect was insufficient, Fitch said. That I had made the correct assessment with the information available. I told myself that for 2 years. His jaw moved. I was very good at telling myself that. Merritt had put down her pen. She was looking at Fitch with the expression of a lawyer watching a situation develop in a direction that has moved outside the space where legal advice is useful. Nora said nothing. She was looking at Fitch directly for the first time in this meeting, and what she was seeing was not the man who had suspended her, or the man who had talked over her in rounds, or the man who had built a 6-year career on the confidence that his judgment was the judgment that mattered. She was seeing someone sitting in a room with the weight of a specific decision, one decision, made 2 years ago in a hospital in Billings on a post-surgical floor in front of a chart that a nurse had flagged pressing down on everything he had constructed on top of it. She had not expected to feel anything particular in this moment. She felt something anyway. Not sympathy exactly, not satisfaction. Something that didn't have a clean name, the complicated human response to watching a person arrive, however belatedly and however inadequately, at the thing they had been avoiding. Swick said, to no one specifically, we're going to need to suspend Dr. Fitch's clinical privileges pending the board's investigation. Merritt nodded once. Yes. Effective immediately. Yes. Fitch did not react to this. He was still looking at the point past Nora's shoulder. She had the sense that he was not in this room, in the full sense of the phrase, that some part of him had traveled back to a floor in Billings, to a chart, to a flag that a nurse had made, and that he had dismissed with the absolute authority of a man who had never seriously considered that he might be wrong. Swick looked at Nora. Your suspension, he said. I'm rescinding it effective today. Formally and in writing. The conduct citation will be removed from your personnel record. Nora held his gaze. And the clinical interventions. Both of them. A pause. Both interventions will be formally reviewed and documented as appropriate patient care in the context of the available resources and clinical presentations. I need that in writing as well. You'll have it by end of day. She nodded. She stood. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She looked once more at Fitch, who still had not moved from his position, still looking at the invisible point that only he could see. She did not say anything to him. There was nothing to say that the documentation had not already said more precisely. She walked to the door and had her hand on it when Swick said, "Ms. Calloway." She stopped. "The policy changes you proposed in the memo you submitted in March. The secondary review requirement for overridden nursing assessments." He was looking at his legal pad. "I'd like you to write it up, formally, as a proposal for the Department Protocols Committee." Nora held the handle for a moment. "I'll have it to you by end of next week," she said. She walked out. The corridor was ordinary. The sounds of the hospital were ordinary. She walked to the elevator and rode it to the ground floor and walked through the lobby and through the front doors and out into the Denton Ridge afternoon, which was clear and cold and smelled of the mountains. And she stood on the sidewalk outside the building and let herself breathe for a moment before she started moving again. She had taken 4 steps toward the crosswalk when her phone rang. "Investigator Groff," she answered. "We've received the documentation from this morning," Groffick said. "I've reviewed the core materials." A pause, the kind that preceded something the speaker had decided needed a certain amount of care. "There's something in your submission I need to ask you about directly." "Go ahead," Nora said. "The medication override incident. March 15th. The patient was a 68-year-old male, post-cardiac event, admitted for monitoring. You flagged a potential interaction between the prescribed anticoagulant and a secondary medication that had been added to his chart that morning." "Yes." Dr. Fitch reviewed the flag and overrode it. "Yes." The patient was discharged 2 days later. "Do you know his current status?" Nora stopped walking. She was standing on the sidewalk half a block from the hospital. A truck went past. A dog somewhere was barking at something that wasn't there. "I followed up on him 3 weeks after discharge," she said carefully. "Through the follow-up care coordinator. Through the follow-up care coordinator, he had been readmitted to a facility in Missoula with a bleeding event. I documented the follow-up in my personal records." A pause. "Miss Calloway," Groff said, "the patient you're describing, a Mr. Wallace Pruitt, died in that Missoula facility 11 days after the readmission. The cause of death was recorded as a hemorrhagic complication, secondary to anticoagulant therapy." Nora did not move. The street was quiet around her. The mountains were there at the edge of the sky, enormous and indifferent, the way they always were. "The interaction you flagged," Groff continued. "Our medical consultant reviewed your notation this morning. He believes the flag was clinically appropriate and that the prescribed combination carried a documented elevated risk of hemorrhagic complication in a patient with Mr. Pruitt's cardiac history." Another pause. "The override is in the chart, with Dr. Fitch's signature." Nora stood on the sidewalk outside Harlow Falls Medical Center. Wallace Pruitt, 68 years old, post-cardiac event. She had checked on him through the follow-up coordinator because that was how she worked. She did not discharge patients from her attention the moment they left the building, especially not when she had flagged something that had not been addressed. She had gotten a summary from the coordinator and noted the Missoula readmission in her document and had not known until this moment that the readmission had ended the way Groff was describing. She had not known because nobody had told her, because she was a suspended nurse in a facility where her documentation went into administrative queues and was not responded to, and the follow-up care system was not designed to loop clinical staff into outcomes for patients who had left the building weeks earlier, especially not clinical staff who were no longer technically on the floor. "Ms. Calloway," Groff said, "I need to ask you whether you have any additional documentation pertaining to Mr. Pruitt specifically. Anything beyond what you submitted this morning?" "Yes," Nora said. Her voice was steady. She was making it steady. "I have the full follow-up notation, including the readmission summary from the coordinator. I can send it within the hour. Please do." A pause. "I'm also going to tell you," Groff said, that the nature of this investigation has changed as of this conversation. What began as a complaint review is now a formal disciplinary investigation. We'll be issuing a temporary suspension of Dr. Fitch's medical license pending the outcome. The facility has already been notified of the clinical privileges suspension through the standard channel, but the board's action is separate and significantly broader. Nora absorbed this. One more thing, Groff said, and I'm telling you this because you're a cooperating witness, and I believe you've earned it. The prior complaint from Billings, the patient death that initiated it. A careful pause. Our medical consultant's preliminary review of that case, in combination with your documentation from Harlow Falls, suggests a pattern of conduct going back at least 4 years, possibly longer. The street was still quiet. The dog had stopped barking. How many patients? Nora asked. Groff did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice had shifted, not less professional, but differently careful, in the way that clinical people and investigative people both get careful when the number is larger than the person they're telling is prepared for. We don't have a confirmed figure yet, she said. That's part of what the investigation will determine. Nora stood on the sidewalk for a long moment after the call ended. She looked at the hospital building. She had spent 11 months in that building, doing the work the way she had always done, the work completely, carefully, with the documentation. That was the only thing that survived when everything else became contested. She had not known, in February, that the pattern she was documenting had a history that preceded her arrival. She had not known, in March, that the flag she submitted about Wallace Pruitt's medication interaction would become part of a board investigation into a physician whose conduct had been generating harm for longer than she had been in Montana. She had not known any of it. She had only done what she always did. She started walking. Not home this time, back toward the hospital entrance, because she had a document to pull and send, and the document needed to be sent within the hour. And the document might be the thing that answered Groff's question about the number of patients, and that number mattered. And whatever it was, somebody needed to make sure it was accurate. She was 4 steps from the entrance when the doors opened from the inside. Dr. Priya Anand came out, still in scrubs, clearly between patients, rather than at the end of a shift. She stopped when she saw Nora. She said, "I heard about Fitch." "News travels fast," Nora said. "Patrice told me. She said his privileges were suspended." Anand's expression was careful in the way it got when she was processing something complex. "Is it the board?" "Yes." A pause. "Is there more to it than the conduct review?" Nora looked at her. Anand was 2 years out of residency and had the particular combination of clinical intelligence and personal integrity that was less common than medical training. Like to believe it was. And she had demonstrated in the past 48 hours that she was willing to act on that integrity in rooms where acting on it was uncomfortable. "Yes," Nora said. "There's more to it." Anand absorbed this. Her jaw tightened slightly. "How much more?" Nora held her gaze. "I don't have the full number yet, but more than this facility. More than what I documented." Something moved through Anand's expression, not shock exactly, because she was a person who had spent enough time in medicine to understand that institutional failures rarely existed in isolation, but the specific, controlled response of someone receiving information that confirms a suspicion they had been hoping was wrong. She looked at the hospital entrance. She looked at Nora. "What do you need?" she said. It was the right question, asked in exactly the right tone, direct, practical, without drama. Nora had been on the receiving end of that question in other contexts, from other people, and she recognized it as one of the few genuinely useful things one person could say to another when a situation had grown larger than either of them had anticipated. "Right now I need to pull a document from my personal records and send it to the board investigator within the hour," Nora said. After that, she stopped. "I'll let you know." Anand nodded. She stepped aside to let Nora through the entrance. Nora went in. She found a workstation in the family consultation room near the lobby, a room she had sat in with patients' families many times, explaining difficult things in the plain language that difficult things required, and she logged into her personal cloud backup from her phone credentials and pulled up the Wallace Pruitt follow-up notation. She read through it once. She had written it at 11 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Pruitt's discharge, sitting at her kitchen table above the hardware store. After a 9-hour shift and a conversation with the follow-up care coordinator that had lasted 4 minutes and had produced the summary of the Missoula Red Mission in the coordinator's efficient clinical shorthand. She had read the summary, noted the Read mission cause and the anticoagulant flag connection, and documented it in her records with the precision she brought to everything. She had not known then that she was documenting the last event in Wallace Pruitt's life. She read through it again. Then she sent it to Groff with a cover note that was one sentence. Wallace Pruitt follow-up documentation, timestamped original, as discussed. She closed the laptop. She sat in the consultation room for a moment. The room was small and quiet. There was a box of tissues on the side table, which there always was in rooms like this. There was a landscape print on the wall, generic and inoffensive, chosen specifically to be neither memorable nor distressing, which meant it was neither. She had sat in this room with a woman whose husband had coded in the parking lot and had not made it, and with a father whose teenage son had come in with a crush injury from an agricultural accident, and with a grandmother who had been brought in by her neighbor and had looked at Nora with the specific expression of someone who already knew the information was going to be bad and was simply waiting for the precise shape of it. She had sat in Lexicon's conversations and said the things that needed saying in the plainest language available, because that was what those people needed, not softening, not institutional formality, just the accurate information delivered by someone who was present with them in the moment of receiving it. She was thinking about Wallace Pruitt, 68 years old. She had not known him well. He had been in the monitoring unit for 48 hours, a compact man with a dry sense of humor who had complained with genuine but mild irritation about the hospital food and had asked her, at one point, whether she thought he was going to be fine. She had told him she thought so, which had been the honest answer at the time. She had flagged the medication interaction and submitted it and believed that the system would process it appropriately. She had not known that the system, in the form of Roland Fitch, would look at the flag and see an overstep rather than a warning. She had not known, but she had documented, and the documentation was now with people who could do something with it, and the investigation had moved from a complaint review to a formal disciplinary process, and the number of patients that process might ultimately account for was a number she didn't have yet, and the not having of it was its own weight. She stood up. She walked out of the consultation room and through the lobby and signed out at the front desk and walked out of Harlow Falls Medical Center into the late afternoon. And she was standing on the sidewalk for the second time in an hour when her phone buzzed. Not Groff this time. Corvith, she answered. Valdez wants to talk to you, he said. No preamble. That was Corvath. She's supposed to be resting. I told her that. And she told me what she tells me every time I tell her to rest. A brief pause that contained, she thought, the ghost of something almost like amusement. She's asking about the prior complaint. The Billings case. Nora stopped walking. How does she know about Billings? Because I told her, Corvath said, and because she made some calls of her own this afternoon. A pause. Nora, the patient who died in Billings, the 44-year-old, the nurse who filed the original complaint. What about her? She filed it and then withdrew it 14 months later. The withdrawal is why the complaint went inactive. His voice was careful now, in the specific way it had been careful when he was delivering information he had assessed for impact before delivering it. This withdrew it 6 months after she was terminated from the Billings facility. Wrongful termination complaint was also filed and also withdrawn. Same timeline. Nora was very still on the sidewalk. The nurse's name is Sandra Okafor, Corveth said. She's currently working at a long-term care facility in Bozeman. Groff's team is going to her tomorrow. Another pause. I thought you should know before they get there, because Sandra Okafor withdrew that complaint because someone made it very clear to her what the cost of not withdrawing it would be. And the person who made that clear, he stopped. Nora already knew. Was it documented? She asked. Not officially. But Valdez found someone who was there. A ward clerk at the Billings facility who kept notes. Personal notes. The way you do. The mountains were still at the edge of the sky. The town was running its ordinary evening around her. Corvath, Nora said. Yeah. This is bigger than I thought. A pause. Yeah, he said. It is. She hung up and stood on the sidewalk for another 30 seconds, which was as long as she allowed herself before she started moving again. The thing about information that reframes everything that came before it is that it requires a specific kind of processing, not emotional processing, not yet, but structural. Taking the new shape of the situation and rebuilding the map from scratch with the corrected coordinates. Nora had learned to do this quickly in environments where the map changed fast, and the cost of clinging to the old version was measured in outcomes rather than feelings. So she rebuilt it on the walk home. Sandra Okafor had filed a complaint 2 years ago about a patient death in Billings. She had filed it and then withdrawn it under pressure, not legal pressure, not institutional pressure in the formal sense, but the particular pressure that comes when someone makes it clear that continuing to push will cost you more than you can afford to lose. She had lost her job. She had filed a wrongful termination complaint and withdrawn that too. She had moved to Bozeman and taken a position at a long-term care facility and had been living for the past 2 years with a knowledge of what she had witnessed and the decision she had made under circumstances that did not offer her a clean option. And a ward clerk at the Billings facility had kept notes. Personal notes. The way Nora kept notes. The way Patrice Dole kept a separate log. The way people who worked in institutions that did not protect them eventually learned to protect themselves through documentation, through the parallel record that existed outside the official system, and therefore could not be buried by the same mechanisms that buried official complaints. There were more of them than Fitch had calculated. That was the thing he had not understood, or had understood and dismissed, which amounted to the same result, that the people he had been dismissing were also watching and recording and waiting for a moment when the accumulation of what they had recorded reached a person with the authority and the inclination to act on it. Nora had been that moment. Not because she was exceptional. She was competent and she was thorough, and she was willing to act in situations where action was required, but she was not exceptional. She was simply the person who had been in the right position at the right time, with 11 months of documentation and a contact in a regulatory capacity, and a military captain who made calls to people who knew how things worked. She reached her apartment and went upstairs and sat at her kitchen table and thought about Sandra Okafor in Bozeman, who was going to receive a visit from Investigator Groff's team tomorrow morning, and who was going to have to decide, for the second time, whether to step into the space that the first decision had cost her so much to leave. She hoped the ward clerk's notes were good. She hoped they were time-stamped. The formal review hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 4 days after Fitch's clinical privileges were suspended. It was not a criminal proceeding that determination would come later, if the board's investigation produced sufficient grounds, which was a separate track operating on a separate timeline. The Tuesday hearing was a facility-level review convened by the hospital's peer review committee, with the board's investigative findings incorporated as reference material. Its purpose was to formally assess the conduct complaints against Dr. Fitch, the validity of Nora's suspension, and the policy failures that had allowed documented clinical concerns to go unaddressed for the duration of her tenure. Nora was not required to present. She chose to. She spent the weekend preparing, which was not the same thing as rehearsing. She did not rehearse. Rehearsal was for people who needed to manage their presentation, and she had never been particularly interested in presentation. She organized. She arranged her documentation in the sequence that would be most legible to a committee that was not, for the most part, composed of people with a detailed understanding of the clinical specifics. She translated where translation was necessary, not simplifying, but contextualizing, which was a different thing. On Sunday evening, Patrice Dole called her. Sandra Okafor called me, Patrice said. Nora straightened. How did she get your number? Groff's team gave it to her. Said we were both cooperating witnesses and that it might be useful for us to connect. A pause. She sounds tired. She has reason to be. She said she's coming to the hearing. She asked if she could sit in the same section as you. Patrice's voice had the careful quality it got when she was saying something that mattered and was aware of its weight. I told her I'd ask. Yes, Nora said immediately. She also said. Patrice stopped. Started again. She said she's sorry she withdrew the complaint. She wanted you to know that. Nora was quiet for a moment. She doesn't owe me anything, I told her that. She said it anyway. After she hung up, Nora sat at her table for a while without doing anything in particular. Outside, the hardware store was dark, and the street was quiet, and the mountains were invisible in the night sky, but present in the way they were always present in Denton Ridge as a felt mass at the edge of everything, enormous and unhurried and indifferent to the specific human dramas unfolding in the town below them. She thought about a 44-year-old woman in a hospital in Billings whose name she did not know, who had died of a pulmonary embolism that a nurse had flagged and a physician had dismissed. She thought about Wallace Pruitt and his dry humor about the hospital food and the way he had asked her whether he was going to be fine. She thought about those two people and the distance between their deaths and this Tuesday hearing, which was a distance measured not in miles or in time, but in the accumulated weight of documentation that had been building in multiple places simultaneously, held by multiple people who had each decided in their own way and in their own time that the record mattered more than the cost of keeping it. She went to bed at 10:30. She slept. The Tuesday hearing convened at 9 a.m. in the hospital's main conference room, which was larger than the second-floor room where Swick had conducted his previous administrative conversations, and which communicated by its size and its arrangement that this was a different category of proceeding. The peer review committee occupied one side of the long table, 7 members, a mix of senior physicians, nursing leadership, and 2 external members required by the facility's accreditation standards. Swick sat at the end of the table in a chair that was not quite at the committee's side and not quite at the presenting side, which reflected accurately his current position in the situation, responsible for the institutional failures, under review, and simultaneously the person responsible for conducting the review. It was not a comfortable position. He occupied it without complaint, which Nora noted and filed. Dana Merritt, the hospital's legal representative, was present. A representative from the board's investigative office was present, not Groff herself, but a deputy investigator named Theo Bassett, who had the quiet, comprehensive attentiveness of someone whose job was to observe and record rather than to direct. Fitch was present. He had a lawyer beside him, a man named Arthur Wiles, who had the expensive, unhurried quality of someone accustomed to representing people whose professional situations had become legally complicated. Wiles had spent the preceding 3 days, Nora's contact had told her, attempting to negotiate the terms of Fitch's participation in the hearing. He had not been entirely successful. Fitch was here, which meant some negotiation had failed. Sandra Okafor was in the room. She was sitting against the wall, in the observer section, beside Patrice Dole. Nora had seen her when she came in, a woman in her early 40s with a composed, watchful expression and the particular posture of someone who had made a difficult decision and was managing the physical consequences of having made it. She met Nora's eyes briefly when Nora entered and gave a small, precise nod. Nora nodded back. Dr. Priya Anand was also present in the presenting area, which meant she had been called as a formal witness rather than as an observer, which meant the committee had reviewed her voluntary statement and determined her testimony was relevant to the proceedings. The committee chair, a silver-haired physician named Dr. Marguerite Sosulis, who had the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had run enough of these proceedings to have shed any residual discomfort with them, opened session with a statement of scope and then turned immediately to the documentation. Nora's documentation. The committee had received the full package 11 months of timestamped records, the clinical summaries, the submitted memos, and their administrative non-responses, the Wallace-Pruitt follow-up notation, the cross-references to the board's investigative findings. Solis walked through the structure of it with the efficiency of someone who had done her preparation thoroughly. Ms. Calloway, she said, I'd like you to walk the committee through the February incident first. In your own words, without reference to the documentation. Then we'll use the documentation to verify. Nora walked them through it. She was precise and unadorned. She described what she had observed, what she had documented, when she had submitted it, what response she had received, and what the patient outcome had been. She did not characterize Fitch's decision. She described it. The characterization, she understood, was the committee's job, not hers. She walked them through April the same way. And then, through March, Wallace-Pruitt, the medication interaction flag, the override, the discharge, the follow-up, the Missoula Rid mission, the outcome she had not known about until Groff told her on the sidewalk 4 days ago. The room was very quiet when she finished the Pruitt section. Solis looked at the documentation. She looked at Nora. You flagged the interaction through the formal channel. Yes. And the flag was overridden by Dr. Fitch without a formal response to you. Without any response. The override is time-stamped in the chart. There is no corresponding communication to me or to the record explaining the clinical basis for the override. Solis made a note. She looked at Fitch. Wiles put his hand briefly on Fitch's arm, the lawyer's signal for, "Let me handle this." He said, Dr. Fitch exercised his clinical judgment in reviewing Ms. Calloway's flag and determined that the prescribed combination was appropriate for this patient's specific presentation. The medical record reflects that determination. The medical record reflects the overrides, Solis said. It does not reflect the clinical reasoning. Physicians are not required to document the reasoning behind every clinical decision in response to a nursing flag. Solis. They are, Solis said without heat, when the flag concerns a potential medication interaction in a post-cardiac patient and the patient subsequently dies of a hemorrhagic complication consistent with that interaction. She looked at Wiles with the expression of a person who has just laid a fact on the table and is waiting for the other party to decide whether to engage with it or attempt to move around it. The board's preliminary findings on Mr. Pruitt's case are part of the record before this committee. I'd recommend you review them before your next statement. Wiles reviewed them. He was quiet for a moment after. Then he said with less confidence than he had brought into the room, Dr. Fitch's clinical decisions were made in good faith with the information available at the time. That determination, Solis said, is what this committee is here to assess. The hearing moved forward. Anand testified to the mass casualty event, what she had witnessed, what she had assessed, the clinical picture at the moment of Nora's intervention. She was precise in the way that good physicians are precise, anchored in observable fact, careful about the distinction between what she had seen and what she had inferred, and clear about the clinical significance of the timeline. In your assessment, Solis asked her, was the delay in intervention that would have occurred if Ms. Calloway had not acted, was that delay clinically significant? Anand did not hesitate. Yes. Based on the patient's presentation at the moment, Miss. Calloway intervened. A delay of 60 to 90 additional seconds would have moved the patient from critical but recoverable to a resuscitation scenario with significantly lower probability of the outcome we achieved. And the clinical intervention Ms. Calloway performed, was it within the standard of care for the presenting condition? It was the standard of care for the presenting condition, Anand said. Not approximate, not adequate, standard. Wiles objected to the characterization on procedural grounds. Solis noted the objection and continued. Patrice Dole testified to the medication override incident and to the 2 memos she had submitted and the non-response she had received. She was direct and a little stiff, the way people are when they are doing something that requires courage and are managing the physical presentation of that courage carefully. When she was done, she looked at Nora for a brief moment and then looked away, which Nora understood as its own kind of acknowledgement. Then Solis said, "We'll hear from Sandra Okafor." Wiles was on his feet immediately. Ms. Okafor's testimony pertains to a separate facility and a separate incident that is not within the scope of this committee's. The scope of this committee, Solis said, includes assessing whether the pattern of conduct documented at this facility represents an isolated series of incidents or a sustained behavioral pattern with a prior history. Ms. Okafor's testimony is directly relevant to that determination. She looked at Wiles with the flat patience of someone who has already made the ruling and is simply waiting for the objection to finish. Your objection is noted. Sandra Okafor walked to the presenting table. She sat down. She was composed in the specific way of someone who had been preparing for a long time, not rehearsed, but resolved. The difference between those two things was visible to anyone who looked carefully enough. She described the Billings patient. She described the nursing flag and Fitch's override and the 6 hours between the override and the patient's death. She described filing the complaint and what had followed the conversations with hospital administration that had become progressively less collegial and more pointed. The termination that was presented as a performance review outcome and that everyone involved knew was not a performance review outcome. The advice she had received from a lawyer she could not afford to continue retaining that had shaped her decision to withdraw. She spoke for 19 minutes. At the end of it, the room had the quality that rooms get when everyone in them has received the same piece of information at the same time and is sitting with the weight of it. Fitch was looking at the table. He had been looking at the table for most of Sandra Okafor's testimony. Not avoiding it, Nora thought. Just sitting with it. The way he had sat with it in the second-floor conference room 3 days ago, when he had said the things his lawyer had told him not to say and had said them anyway in the flat, stripped-down voice of a man who had finally stopped maintaining the version of himself that required the most maintenance. When Okafor finished, Solis said, "Dr. Fitch, your counsel has indicated you wish to make a statement." Wiles's expression suggested that this was not entirely accurate, that the situation with the statement was more complicated than Solis's phrasing implied, that there had been a disagreement about the statement and its wisdom, and that the disagreement had not been fully resolved. But Fitch was already shifting forward in his chair, and Wiles, who was a good enough lawyer to recognize when a client had made a decision that was going to happen regardless of his advice, settled back. Fitch said, "The medication flag on the Pruitt case was clinically appropriate. I reviewed it and I concluded the risk was acceptable. I was wrong." He stopped. His voice was very even not emotional, but stripped of the professional veneer that had been its normal quality. In the Billings case, the nursing flag was consistent with the patient's early PE presentation. I reviewed it and I discharged it as within acceptable parameters. I was wrong about that too. He looked at Solis directly. I'm not disputing the documentation. I'm not disputing the clinical record. I am telling you that the decisions I made were made with the information I had, and that the information I had was assessed through a framework that gave my judgment more weight than it deserved, and gave the clinical concerns of nursing staff less weight than they warranted. A pause. I've known that for some time. I did not act on it. The room was very still. Solis looked at him for a moment. Then she made a note. She looked at the committee. We'll recess for 30 minutes. The room began to move. Nora stood. She was aware of Patrice at the wall and of Sandra Okafor still sitting at the presenting table with the particular stillness of someone who has spent an enormous amount of energy and is now in the quiet that follows it. She was aware of Anand near the door, talking quietly with Bassett, the board's observer. She was aware of Fitch, who had not moved from his chair, and of Wiles beside him, who was speaking in a low, rapid voice that Fitch appeared to be listening to without particularly processing. She walked to the window. Outside was the parking lot, and beyond it, the edge of town, and beyond that, the mountains. She had looked at this view from the inside of this building many times in 11 months, and had not, most of those times, stopped to actually see it. It was a significant view. The mountains were enormous, and the town was small. And the hospital sat in the middle of that proportion, doing the specific human work of keeping people alive in a landscape that was entirely indifferent to whether they managed it or not. Patrice appeared beside her. "How do you think it's going?" she said. It was not really a question about the hearing. It was the question people asked when they were processing something too large to ask about directly, and needed a proxy. "The way it needed to go," Nora said. Patrice looked at the mountains. "You think they'll reinstate you fully? Not just the suspension rescission. Actually reinstate. I think they'll do what the documentation supports." "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one," Nora said. Patrice made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You're going to be insufferable to work with," she said, "if they actually put you back." Nora glanced at her. Patrice was looking at the mountains, and the expression on her face had the complicated qualities of someone who has spent a long time in an institution that failed them in small, consistent ways, and who is now standing in a moment where the institution is being held to account for it, and who is feeling the full, mixed weight of that, the relief and the anger and the exhaustion and the small, fragile thing underneath all of those that might, given time and changed conditions, eventually become something closer to hope. "I'm going to make that your problem," Nora said. Patrice said nothing, but something in her posture shifted. The committee reconvened and deliberated for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Nora waited in the hallway with Patrice and Anand, who had stayed. Sandra Okafor came out of the hearing room during the recess and sat in a chair along the wall and didn't speak much, and nobody asked her to. She had done what she came to do. The rest of it was going to take the time it took. At 2:17 p.m., Solis emerged and asked the presenting parties to return to the room. The committee's findings were read into the record in the efficient, formal language of institutional proceedings, which was its own kind of translation layer over the human substance of what was being communicated. Nora's suspension, unjustified. Rescinded in full, effective the prior Thursday, confirmed in the committee's finding. The conduct citation removed from her personnel record entirely. The committee's formal determination was that both clinical interventions, the mass casualty event and the Valdez intervention, represented appropriate responses to acute clinical emergencies by a qualified clinician, and that the institutional framing of those interventions as protocol violations reflected a systematic undervaluation of nursing clinical judgment that the committee found unacceptable. That last phrase, systematic undervaluation of nursing clinical judgment, was read in the same even tone as the rest of it, but it landed differently. Nora watched it land on the faces of the nurses in the room, Patrice, and 2 others who had come in for the reconvening, and she watched what it did to them, which was not dramatic and not nothing. Fitch's clinical privileges suspended indefinitely pending the board's investigation. The committee formally referred the Pruitt case and the Billings case to the board as connected elements of a pattern of conduct warranting comprehensive disciplinary review. The referral was documented and would be transmitted to the board within 48 hours. The committee also issued a directive requiring the development of a secondary review protocol for overridden nursing clinical assessments, a formal policy change requiring implementation within 90 days with compliance, reported back to the committee. That last one had come from Nora's March memo, the one that had been received and not responded to. It was now a committee directive. Solis closed the formal session. The room began to move again, the particular controlled dispersal of a formal proceeding that has reached its conclusion. People gathering their materials and their thoughts and the various things they had brought into the room and would be carrying differently on the way out. Wiles was speaking to Fitch near the door. Fitch was listening with the stripped down quality he had brought to his statement, present but reduced. The professional architecture fully down now, the man underneath it, sitting with the full weight of the afternoon. Nora was putting her documentation back into her folder when she became aware of someone standing near the table. Sandra Okafor. She was not tall. She had the particular physical presence of someone who had made themselves smaller, professionally, for a period of time, and had not quite fully recovered the posture she had before. She looked at Nora with the direct, unguarded expression of a person who has finished with the careful management of their presentation and is just looking. "Thank you," she said. Nora shook her head. "You did this. You kept the record the first time. You came back when it mattered. I withdrew the first one. You came back," Nofai said. "That's the part that counts." Okafor held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the committee table, at the empty chairs, at the room that had just produced a set of findings that were going to move through multiple institutional systems over the coming weeks and months and produce consequences neither of them could fully predict yet. "The patient in Billings," Okafor said. Her name was Teresa Marchand. She had a daughter in college. She was a high school art teacher. She was supposed to be discharged in 3 days. She stopped. I say her name whenever I can, because if I don't say it, the record just says patient. And she wasn't just a patient. Nora was quiet for a moment. "Teresa Marchand," she said. Okafor nodded. She picked up her bag and walked out of the room. Nora stood at the table for a moment longer. The room was almost empty now. Bassett, the board observer, was making a final notation in his record. Swick was speaking quietly with Solis near the door, the low, serious conversation of two administrators who were going to be working through the institutional implications of this afternoon for considerable time. She picked up her folder. She was almost to the door when Swick said her name. She turned. He crossed the room to her. He was carrying his legal pad, and whatever was written on it was extensive, and his expression had the quality it had been developing since Thursday, not the managed institutional neutrality of his normal register, but something more honest and considerably less comfortable. "The policy proposal," he said. "The secondary review protocol. I'd like you to lead the implementation working group." Nora looked at him. "I'm not reinstated to a clinical position yet. Formally, the reinstatement paperwork will be complete by end of day. I'm asking ahead of that." He paused. "I'm asking because you wrote the memo that this directive came from, and because you've been doing this work for 11 months, and you understand the floor in a way that most of the people I'd otherwise ask to run this group don't." Another pause, shorter, "And because I should have listened to the memo in March." Nora held his gaze. He meant that. It was not a performance of accountability, it was actual accountability. Arriving in the specific and unglamorous form it usually arrived in, which was late and inadequate and the best available. "I'll do it," she said. She walked out. She was in the elevator, alone, descending to the ground floor when her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize. Montana area code. She opened it. "This is Arthur Wiles. I represent Dr. Fitch. He's asked me to communicate something to you directly. He understands if you prefer not to receive it. Please let me know." Nora stared at the message. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. She typed back, "What does he want to communicate?" The response came before she reached the lobby doors. "He wants you to know that there's a third case. Not Billings. Not Pruitt. A patient at this facility prior to your arrival. He says the documentation exists in the hospital record, but was filed under an incorrect chart number. He says he can tell you where to look." Nora stopped walking. The lobby was moving around her visitors, staff, the ordinary human traffic of a working hospital, none of it aware of the message on her phone or the third case it was pointing toward, or the question of why Roland Fitch, on the afternoon of the hearing that had just formally dismantled 6 years of his professional authority, had chosen this moment to point her toward something he had spent those 6 years keeping buried. She stood in the middle of the lobby and looked at the message. A third case, at this facility, before she arrived. She typed back one word, "Where?" Wiles responded in under a minute. The chart number was a sequence she didn't recognize, not the standard Harlow Falls formatting, which used a different alphanumeric structure. It had been filed under an old system. Wiles explained in a follow-up message, from a period when the hospital was transitioning between electronic record platforms. Records filed during that 18-month window existed in the system, but were not indexed to the primary patient search. They could be accessed only by direct chart number entry. The patient's name, Wiles wrote, was Carl Dempsey, 61 years old at the time of admission, admitted 14 months before Nora arrived in Denton Ridge. Discharged, readmitted 6 days later. Died on the second admission of a cause that the death certificate listed as cardiac arrhythmia secondary to medication toxicity. There was a nursing flag in the chart. Filed before the first discharge. Overridden. Nora stood in the lobby and read this twice. Then she walked to the information desk and asked for the medical records office on the 3rd floor and took the stairs because the elevator was slower and she was done being slower than she needed to be. The medical records clerk was a young man named Derek who had the mildly startled quality of someone whose afternoon had been entirely unremarkable until this moment. Nora gave him the chart number and watched his expression move through confusion. The format was wrong for the current system into the particular focused attention of someone who enjoys solving a problem when one presents itself. He navigated through 2 legacy database screens and a third interface she had never seen before, and then he said, "Here it is," in the tone of mild triumph that people use when they locate something that was not supposed to be difficult to find. He printed it. She read it standing at the counter. Carl Dempsey had been admitted for monitoring following a syncopal episode, a fainting event with a cardiac etiology that was consistent with his documented history. The attending on record was Roland Fitch. The nursing flag, filed on day 2 of the admission by a floor nurse whose name Nora did not recognize, noted a concern about the interaction between his existing medication regimen and a new prescription that Fitch had added that morning. The flag was specific. It cited the mechanism of the potential interaction, referenced the patient's renal function values from that morning's labs, and recommended a nephrology consult before continuing the new prescription. The override was timestamped 4 hours later. Fitch's signature. No documented rationale, no nephrology consult. Carl Dempsey was discharged on day 3. He was readmitted 6 days later in acute distress. He died on day 2 of the second admission. The death certificate listed cardiac arrhythmia secondary to medication toxicity, which was a clinical description that mapped directly onto the interaction the nursing flag had identified, and that the nephrology consult would have caught. The floor nurse who had filed the flag was no longer listed as current staff. Nora stood at the counter with the printed chart in her hand and looked at the dates. Carl Dempsey had died 14 months before she arrived in Denton Ridge. His chart had been in this building the entire time she had been working in it. The flag that could have saved him had been in the system the entire time, buried in a legacy database under a non-standard chart number, accessible if you knew the number, invisible if you didn't. Fitch had known the number. He had been carrying it for 14 months. And today, on the afternoon of a hearing that had just produced the most significant formal accounting of his professional conduct in 6 years, he had chosen to give it to her. She thought about that choice on the walk downstairs. It was not a simple choice, and she was not going to pretend it was. It was the choice of a man who had spent a long time maintaining a version of himself that required significant effort, and who had, in the past 72 hours, stopped being able to maintain it. It did not make him a good person. It did not undo Carl Dempsey, or Wallace Pruitt, or Teresa Marchand. It did not even fully make sense from a self-interest perspective, because pointing her toward this chart made his situation considerably worse, not better. Maybe that was the point. Maybe it was the only thing left that he could do that was not about managing his position, or protecting his license, or controlling the narrative. Maybe pointing at the buried chart was the specific, inadequate, and permanent act of someone who had run out of ways to make the manageable version of himself function, and had arrived, finally, at the unmanageable truth of what was underneath it. She was not going to assign him redemption for it. That was not hers to assign. But she was going to use what he had given her, which was the only thing that actually mattered. She called Groff from the stairwell. Investigator Groff requested the Dempsey file be transmitted to the board by end of day. Nora arranged it through Derek in medical records, who processed the transmission with the efficient helpfulness of someone who had decided somewhere in the last hour that he was glad to be involved in whatever this was. The transmission went out at 4:43 p.m. At 5:20, Groff called back. The Dempsey adds a third documented patient death with a prior nursing flag override by the same physician, she said. Combined with Pruitt and Marchand, we now have sufficient grounds to refer the matter to the county attorney's office for review of potential criminal negligence. A pause. I want to be clear that referral doesn't guarantee charges. The criminal standard is considerably higher than the disciplinary standard. But the referral will be made. I understand, Nora said. Dr. Fitch's medical license will be formally suspended pending the outcome of both the board's disciplinary process and the county attorney's review. The suspension will be publicly listed in the board's registry as of tomorrow morning. And the hospital's obligations? Harlow Falls is required to notify the families of the 3 identified patients of the investigation's findings. That notification process will be managed by the board in coordination with the facility's legal office. Another pause. There may be additional cases. We're reviewing the full patient record from Fitch's tenure at both facilities. If there are others, they'll be identified. After she hung up, Nora sat for a moment in the stairwell concrete walls, fluorescent light, the hum of the building's ventilation system above her head. It was not a dramatic place to sit with the weight of what had just been set in motion. But most of the moments that actually mattered, she had learned, did not happen in dramatic places. They happened in corridors and stairwells and kitchen tables, and the particular silence that follows a phone call and the unglamorous physical reality of those settings was part of what made them real. 3 families were going to receive notifications about the deaths of people they had already grieved, told now that the deaths had involved a clinical failure that had been documented and overridden and buried. That notification was going to reopen something that had been closed, and reopening, it was going to be terrible. And it was also necessary. And both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither of them canceled the other. She went back to the floor. The following 3 weeks moved at the particular pace of institutional consequence faster than bureaucrats usually moved, slower than justice felt like it should. The board's public registry updated on Wednesday morning, listing Fitch's license as suspended pending investigation. The county attorney's office confirmed receipt of the board's referral on Friday. Harlow Falls issued a formal public statement on the following Monday, acknowledging the investigation, the clinical privilege suspension, and the facility's commitment to cooperating fully with regulatory authorities. This also announced the immediate implementation of a new secondary review protocol for overridden nursing clinical assessments. Nora read the statement once and did not read it again. She was back on the floor by the second week, which was 2 days after her reinstatement. Paperwork was formally complete, and her badge was reissued by an HR coordinator who handed it to her with the slightly overdone warmth of institutional contrition. She took the badge, said thank you, and went to work. The floor felt different and also the same. The difference was in the quality of attention. The way staff moved around her had shifted slightly, a half step more deferential in the small unconscious ways that institutions adjust when the hierarchy reconfigures. She noticed it and didn't particularly want it. She wanted the work, which was the same as it had always been. The patients, the assessments, the flags, the documentation, the 1,000 small decisions that accumulated into whether a person left the building in better condition than they arrived. Patrice Dole worked her same shifts. She was not warmer exactly. She had not been cold before, just careful, the way people are careful when an institution has taught them that carefulness is survival. But something in the carefulness had changed quality. It was still there, but it was now the carefulness of someone choosing it rather than someone defaulting to it. And that was a different thing entirely. Anand stopped by the floor on her first full day back, between her own patients, and said, "Good, just that." One word, in the tone of someone closing a loop. "Good," Nora said back. Anand left. Sandra Okafor sent a message 2 weeks after the hearing. She had been contacted by the board. They had found a 4th patient from the Billings facility, whose case matched the pattern. She was cooperating with the expanded investigation. She was also, she wrote, applying for a position at a hospital in Missoula. She had decided she was done making herself smaller. She thought Nora should know. Nora wrote back, "Good. Don't stop documenting." Okafor wrote, "Never again." The county attorney's office announced in the 3rd week that it was opening a formal criminal negligence inquiry into the deaths of Carl Dempsey and Wallace Pruitt. The inquiry did not guarantee charges, and it would take time. These things always took time, but it was public, it was in the record, and the families of both men had been notified and had been offered the formal acknowledgement that what happened to the people they loved, had not been random or inevitable. Nora heard about the inquiry from Groff, who called to update her as a cooperating witness. She noted it and returned to the chart she had been reviewing, which belonged to a 67-year-old woman with an atypical presentation of chest pain that 2 people had already assessed and found unremarkable, and which Nora found not unremarkable at all. She flagged it, she documented it precisely. She submitted it through the new secondary review protocol, which required a second physician assessment within 2 hours when a nursing clinical flag was submitted on a patient currently under evaluation for discharge. The second physician came. He reviewed the flag. He ordered an additional ECG and a troponin level. The troponin was elevated. The patient was not discharged. She was admitted to the cardiac unit and started on the appropriate treatment protocol, and was, 3 days later, stable and recovering, and likely to leave the hospital in considerably better condition than she would have if the flag had been processed the way flags had been processed at Harlow Falls Medical Center for the past 6 years. Nobody made a ceremony of it. That was the point. That was always the point. The work was not supposed to be a ceremony. It was supposed to be the standard, the floor below, which patient care did not fall, held in place not by any individual clinician's heroism, but by a system that took clinical warnings seriously, regardless of who generated them. That was what the policy change was for. That was what all of it had been for. 4 weeks after the hearing, Director Swick asked Nora to join him for a conversation. In his office, not the conference room, his actual office, which was smaller, and had a window that faced the mountains, and a desk covered in the organized disorder of a man who managed his own system for doing it and had developed a system for doing it that was not immediately legible to anyone else. He told her the peer review committee had formally recommended her for a senior clinical role, a newly created position titled Lead Clinical Safety Officer for Emergency Services, which carried authority over the ER's protocol review process, staff clinical training, and the implementation and compliance monitoring of the sanctuary review policy. It was not a purely administrative role. She would still work patient care shifts. The administrative component was structured around the patient care, not the other way around. She looked at him across the desk. "Why me specifically?" she said. "Not fishing, asking." Swick looked at his desk for a moment. "Because you've been doing this job informally for 11 months without being asked to. Because you documented everything correctly, even when nothing came of the documentation. Because when the moment arrived that required someone to act, you acted, and the outcome was the right outcome." He paused. "And because the policy that's now a committee directive started as a memo you wrote in March that I didn't respond to. That's on my record in a way that I'm not going to pretend it isn't. The least I can do is give the person who wrote it the authority to implement it." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I want Patrice Dole on the implementation working group," she said, "and Anand as the physician liaison for the protocol review." "Done. And I want the secondary review compliance reports submitted to the board quarterly, not just internally. External accountability." Swick looked at her. "That's an unusual request." "Yes," she said, a pause. "Done," he said. She took the role. The morning of her first official day in the new position, Nora arrived at Harlow Falls at 6:42 earlier than her shift required, because that was how she arrived. She clipped her badge to her scrubs in the locker room and walked out into the corridor and stood for a moment in the particular quiet of a hospital floor at the early hour before the full weight of the day has settled onto it. She thought about a lot of things in that moment, and she thought about none of them for very long, because that was also how she worked. She thought about Carl Dempsey and Wallace Pruitt and Teresa Marchand, whose names she was going to say whenever she could, in the way Sandra Okafor had taught her, because the record said patient. And they were not just patients. She thought about the nurse, whose name she still didn't know, who had filed the flag on Carl Dempsey 14 months before Nora arrived, and who was no longer listed as current staff, and whose flag had been buried in a legacy database, but had not been wrong. Had never been wrong. Had simply been unfiled in a system that was not designed to protect the people who filed things into it. She was going to find that nurse's name. She didn't know yet what she would do with it when she found it, but she was going to find it, because a person who does the right thing in a system that doesn't protect them deserves to be known, even if the knowing comes late. She thought about Corvath, who had sent a message 10 days ago that said, "Valdez is fully cleared for duty. She says the chest tube scar is her best one. I told her that was a low bar." She disagreed. Nora had written back, "Tell her I agree with her." Corvath had sent a single punctuation mark in response, which she had interpreted as his version of warmth. She thought about the fact that she had come to Denton Ridge for a change of pace and had gotten 11 months of sustained institutional resistance, followed by 4 days that had rearranged the institution entirely. She was not certain that was what she had meant by a change of pace. But she was also not certain it wasn't, because the truth was that she had come here for the work, and the work had turned out to be larger and more complicated than she had anticipated, and that was fine. Large and complicated was what she was built for. She started walking. The floor was waking up around her. The first shift nurses coming on, the monitors cycling through their overnight summaries, the ambient sounds of a hospital beginning another day of the specific and unglamorous and essential work of keeping people alive. She walked through it with the same unhurried stride she had brought to this floor 11 months ago, the same quality of attention, the same willingness to see what was actually in front of her rather than what was supposed to be there. The difference was the badge. Not because the badge made her more capable, she had been exactly as capable on the days she carried it and the days she didn't. The badge meant the institution had, finally and belatedly and imperfectly, arranged itself around the reality of what she was, rather than the convenient and manageable fiction of what it had preferred her to be. That mattered, not for her ego. For the next nurse who flagged a medication interaction and needed to know that the flag would be taken seriously. For the next patient who arrived in a trauma bay with a presentation that didn't fit the easy protocol. For the next Sandra Okafor, who was sitting with a chart and a decision and needed the system to be the kind of system that made the right choice less costly than the wrong one. That was what the policy was for. That was what the board reporting was for. That was what all 11 months of documentation had been for. In the end, not for her vindication, though the vindication had come, but for the system that would exist after her, in which the next person who saw something and said something would find the process a little less likely to bury what they said. She stopped at the nurse's station. Patrice was already there, updating the overnight handoff notes, her reading glasses on, her expression carrying the particular focused efficiency of someone doing familiar work in a familiar place. She looked up when Nora stopped. "You're early," she said. "I'm always early," Nora said. Patrice looked at her for a moment at the badge, and at the woman wearing it, and at whatever she saw in the particular quality of how Nora was standing in this corridor this morning, which was the same as it had always been, and also not quite. "First flagging meeting is Thursday," Patrice said. "Anand confirmed. Solis from the committee is joining remotely." "Good. I pulled the last 6 months of override data to prepare. There are patterns. There are always patterns," Nora said. "That's the point of looking." Patrice took off her reading glasses and looked at her directly, without the careful management she usually brought to direct eye contact. "You know this doesn't fix everything," she said. "The policy, the new role, all of it. There's another Fitch somewhere. There's always another Fitch somewhere." "I know," Nora said. "So what are we actually doing here?" It was a real question. Not cynical. Patrice was not a cynical person, despite 11 years of working in a system that had given her significant material for cynicism. It was the question of someone who needed to understand the purpose they were working toward in terms that were honest about its limits. Nora thought about it for a moment. "We're making it harder," she said. "For the next one, we're building the kind of floor that makes it harder to bury a flag, harder to dismiss a warning, harder to make a nurse disappear a complaint without consequence." She paused. "We're not fixing people. We're fixing the conditions that let bad decisions go unchallenged. That's not everything, but it's something that outlasts us." Patrice considered this. She put her reading glasses back on. She looked at her notes. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," Nora said. She walked to the trauma bay to begin her shift. The bay was clean and ready, the way it was every morning, equipment staged, monitors active, the specific organized readiness, a space that existed to respond to things that had not happened yet. She stood in it for a moment, the way she sometimes stood in rooms before they filled, taking in the particular phenomenal quality of potential that an empty space carried before the day made its demands on it. She was still the same person who had walked into this building 11 months ago with 2 suitcases and a career history she hadn't disclosed, and a very clear understanding of what she was and what she was there to do. She was also not the same. That was the human part of it, the part that the record didn't capture and the badge didn't represent. The part that was made of 11 months of being dismissed and continuing anyway, of watching people in authority get the situation wrong and documenting the wrongness and waiting for the moment when the documentation would find the right person at the right time. The part that was made of the faces of the people who had stood with her, Patrice's careful loyalty, Anand's precise courage, Anand's Sandra Okafor's costly return, and the faces of the people who hadn't survived long enough for any of this to reach them. Carl Dempsey, Wallace Pruitt, Teresa Marchand. She was carrying them into this bay the same way she carried everything, not as a weight that bent her, but as a record that sharpened her, that kept the work from becoming abstract, that reminded her every shift what the flags were for and why the documentation mattered, and what happened when the system was designed to ignore the people most likely to see what was going wrong. Her radio crackled. Ambulance incoming. ETA 4 minutes. 60-year-old male, altered mental status, unknown cause, vitals unstable. She moved to the bay entrance. She was already thinking about what she would need, running the differential in the automatic, parallel way that good clinical thinking ran, not anxious, just ready. Ready for whatever arrived, ready to see it accurately, to flag it precisely, to act when action was required, and to make certain that what she saw did not disappear into a system that was no longer designed to let it disappear. The ambulance bay doors opened. She went to meet it. That was all. That was everything. A woman in a hospital in Montana at the start of an ordinary shift, walking toward a gurney in a bay that was waiting for her, not because the institution had finally decided she was worth listening to, but because she had never stopped doing the work that made her worth listening to. In the long months before anyone was listening, in the quiet and the documentation and flagging and the flags and the timestamps, in the 11 months of being exactly what she was in a place that had not yet understood what it had. She had not waited to be recognized to be real. She had simply been real and kept the record and trusted that the record would eventually speak in a room with the right people in it. It had. She walked into the bay. The doors closed behind her. The day began.